Hello everyone, I am Mr. Disturbing, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Hey there, night owls. Before we get into tonight's story, I want you to do me a favor. Take a look around whatever room you're in right now. Notice how the shadows fall, how the light hits the corners, how safe and normal everything feels. Remember that feeling, because after what I'm about to tell you, you might find yourself checking those shadows a little more carefully. This story came to me from a man named Elias McKinnon, now in his 70s, living in a small town nestled deep in the West Virginia mountains. What he told me happened back in 1991, when the leaves were turning and the mountain air carried something more than just the scent of autumn. He swears every word is true, and after hearing what he had to say, I believe him. So settle in, turn down the lights, and let me tell you about the hollow behind Blood Ridge. Time has a way of dulling the sharp edges of memory, but some things stay with you, clear as spring water, no matter how many years pass. The autumn of 1991 was one of those times that carved itself so deep into my bones that I still wake up some nights, heart hammering, thinking I can hear it again. That sound that came from the hollow behind Blood Ridge Mountain. I was 42 then, still young enough to think I knew these mountains like the back of my weathered hands, old enough to have earned the respect of men who'd been walking these ridges since before I was born. My cousin Wade was 29 that year, built like a oak stump, with arms that could swing a splitting maul from dawn to dusk without complaint. He'd inherited his daddy's logging operation and had been working the timber lease up on Blood Ridge since early spring. His sister June had just turned 19 and come back home after her first year at Marshall University down in Huntington, full of book learning and city ideas that didn't quite fit in our little hollow of Millstone Creek. The ridge got its name from an old mining accident back in 1923, when a methane pocket blew and painted the rock face red with more than just iron ore. Folks said you could still see the stains when the light hit just right, though I always figured that was just the way the iron and the stone caught the sunset. The hollow behind it was different though, a deep cut in the mountain where the old-timers claimed things got confused, where compasses spun and men who knew these woods better than their own wives somehow found themselves walking in circles until dark. Wade had been cutting timber on the south face of Blood Ridge all through the summer, good stands of poplar and oak that would bring decent money at the mill in Beckley. But by October, he'd worked his way around to the north side, closer to that hollow than any of us had been in years. That's when things started going sideways. The first sign was the silence. Anyone who's spent time in Appalachian woods knows they're never truly quiet. There's always something moving, breathing, calling. Squirrels chattering, birds singing, the rustle of leaves as a deer picks its way through the underbrush. But Wade came home that first week of October talking about patches of forest so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat, areas where even the wind seemed to hold its breath. June was the one who started putting the pieces together. She'd always been sharp, even as a little girl, with eyes that seemed to see things the rest of us missed. She'd come back from college with a head full of folklore classes and anthropology studies, suddenly interested in the old stories our grandparents used to tell. When Wade mentioned the quiet places, she got that look, the one that meant she was chasing after something most folks would be smart enough to leave alone. The mountains in October are something to behold. The maples turn fire red, the poplars go yellow as butter, and the oaks hold onto their leaves like they're made of burnished copper. But that year the colors seemed muted somehow, like looking at the world through old glass. The air had a weight to it, thick and still, even when the wind was blowing. And there was a smell. Not quite decay, not quite smoke, but something in between that made your nose wrinkle and your skin crawl. Wade's logging crew started having problems. Equipment that had been running fine would suddenly break down for no reason. Chainsaw engines seizing up, hydraulic lines on the skidder bursting, the truck radiator developing leaks overnight. But it was the accidents that really got their attention. Nothing major, just the kind of little mishaps that should have been routine but somehow felt wrong. A falling branch that missed Tommy Garrett's head by inches. A tree that fell the wrong way and crushed the lunch cooler where 3 men had been sitting just minutes before. A stump that seemed to shift just as Billy Morrison was stepping over it, sending him tumbling down the slope with a twisted ankle. The crew started talking about moving to a different section of the lease, maybe working some of the timber down closer to the road. But Wade was stubborn as mountain stone, and he'd invested too much time and fuel getting his equipment up there to quit just because of some bad luck. Besides, the trees in that section were prime, straight, tall, and thick enough to bring top dollar. He figured a few more weeks would see the job done. June had been spending her days in the little Carnegie Library in town, digging through old newspapers and county records, chasing down stories that most folks had forgotten or never believed in the first place. She found mentions of the hollow in surveyors' reports from the 1880s, notes about magnetic anomalies and irregular compass readings. There were insurance claims from the 1920s about missing livestock, and a few scattered references to something the Cherokee had called the hunger that walks. The Cherokee had been driven out of these mountains long before my time, but they'd left traces, old trails, stone circles, and stories that got passed down through the white settlers who took their place. According to what June found, the hollow had been a place they avoided, somewhere they'd marked with warning signs and ritual stones. They'd had a word for things like whatever lived back there, spirits that weren't quite ghosts, not quite alive, but something in between that fed on more than just flesh and bone. By the 3rd week of October, Wade's crew was down to just him and Billy Morrison. The others had found excuses to work elsewhere, or simply stopped showing up altogether. Wade was getting frustrated, working longer hours to make up for the missing men, pushing deeper into the timber lease than he'd originally planned. And that's when he started getting close to the hollow itself. The trees changed as you got closer to that place. They grew differently, twisted and gnarled, with bark that looked almost diseased. The leaves fell earlier there, carpeting the ground in a thick, sodden mat that squelched underfoot and released that strange smell every time you disturbed it. The forest floor was wrong too. No understory plants, no ferns or moss, just that thick layer of decomposing leaves and the occasional pale mushroom that looked like it had never seen sunlight. Wade started coming home later and later, sometimes not until well after dark. He'd sit at the kitchen table in his work clothes, drinking coffee that had gone cold hours ago, staring at nothing with eyes that had seen too much. When June or I would try to talk to him, he'd just shake his head and mutter something about needing to finish the job, about not letting the mountain beat him. It was on a Thursday evening, with the sun setting early and the air sharp enough to cut, that Wade came home with something different in his face. Not just exhaustion or frustration, but fear. Real fear. The kind that gets its hooks into a man's soul and doesn't let go. He sat down at the table, pulled off his work gloves, and looked at his hands like he'd never seen them before. June made him supper, but he barely touched it. Just sat there turning his coffee cup around and around, like he was trying to work up the courage to say something. Finally, he started talking about the sound. It had started that afternoon, he said, while he was cutting a big oak about a quarter mile from the hollow's edge. A sound like singing, but not quite human. Too high in some places, too low in others, with harmonies that seemed to come from the trees themselves. At first he'd thought it might be the wind, but there wasn't any wind that day. The air was still as death, and the sound just kept getting louder and more complex, like a whole choir of voices that weren't quite voices. Billy Morrison had heard it too, Wade said, and the older man had gone pale as fresh snow. Billy had been working these mountains for 30 years, and he'd never heard anything like it. He'd wanted to pack up and leave right then, but Wade had convinced him to finish the tree they were working on. The singing had stopped just as suddenly as it started, leaving them in that unnatural silence that had been plaguing the worksite for weeks. That night, I lay awake listening to the house settle around me, thinking about the stories my grandmother used to tell about the old days, when the mountains were wilder and the things that lived in them hadn't yet learned to fear the sound of axes and saws. She'd talked about spirits that could mimic human voices, calling travelers deeper into the woods until they were lost forever. But this sounded different, older somehow, like something that had been waiting in that hollow since before the Cherokee, since before anyone had names for the things that lived in the deep places of the world. The next morning, Wade was gone before sunrise. I found a note on the kitchen table saying he'd taken his equipment up to finish the section near the hollow, that he'd be back before dark. But dark came and went, and Wade didn't come home. June and I waited until nearly midnight before we called the sheriff's department. They said they'd send someone out in the morning, but with the budget cuts and only 3 deputies for the whole county, it would probably be afternoon before anyone could make it up to the lease. June wanted to go looking for him ourselves, but I talked her out of it. The mountains at night are dangerous enough without adding whatever was happening up on Blood Ridge to the equation. Saturday morning dawned gray and cold, with a mist that clung to the hollows like smoke. Sheriff's Deputy Carl Hutchins showed up around 10, young and eager but clearly out of his element when it came to the mountain country. I led him up the logging road to where Wade had been working, following the fresh tire tracks from his truck. We found the truck first, parked at the edge of the work site with the door hanging open and the engine still running. Wade's lunch cooler was sitting on the tailgate, unopened, and his thermos of coffee was still warm. His chainsaw was lying on the ground next to a half-cut oak, the chain still moving slowly as the engine idled. But there was no sign of Wade. Deputy Hutchins started asking questions about Wade's state of mind, whether he'd been drinking, whether there were any family problems that might explain him wandering off. But I could see the worry in the young man's eyes as he looked around at the strange, silent woods. Even someone who'd never set foot in these mountains could tell there was something wrong with this place. We spent the rest of the day searching, calling Wade's name until our voices were hoarse, following every game trail and deer path we could find. But the forest seemed to swallow our calls, and the only answer we got was that unnatural silence pressing in around us like a living thing. As the sun started to set, Deputy Hutchins said he'd have to call in the state police, maybe get a search and rescue team up from Charleston. But I knew it was too late for that. Whatever had taken Wade wasn't going to give him back, and sending more people into those woods would just mean more people disappearing. That night, June made her decision. She'd been quiet all day, but I could see the wheels turning in her head. That same look she'd had as a child when she was working out a puzzle that had everyone else stumped. She waited until I'd gone to bed, then slipped out of the house with a backpack full of supplies and headed up the mountain. I found her note on the kitchen table Sunday morning, written in her careful college handwriting. She'd gone to the hollow, she said, to find Wade, or at least to find out what had happened to him. She'd taken her grandfather's old compass and a map of the area, plus enough food and water for 2 days. She promised to be careful, to stay out of the deep woods, and to come back by Tuesday morning whether she found Wade or not. But Tuesday morning came and went, and June didn't come home. The state police search team arrived on Wednesday, 6 men with tracking dogs and radio equipment. They found June's backpack about a mile from the hollow, torn and scattered like something had ripped it apart in a frenzy. Her water bottles were smashed, her food scattered, and her grandfather's compass was spinning wildly, needle jumping from north to south and back again like it couldn't decide which way was which. They found tracks, too. Human footprints that started out normal but gradually changed, becoming longer and deeper, with claw marks in the soft earth that no human foot should have been able to make. The tracks led deeper into the hollow, following an old game trail that seemed to wind back on itself, creating a pattern that made no sense until you realized it was shaped like a spiral, drawing everything inexorably toward the center. The dogs wouldn't follow the trail. They'd get within 100 yards of the hollow and just stop, whimpering and backing away with their tails between their legs. Even the most experienced tracking hounds, animals that had found lost hunters and escaped convicts in terrain twice as rough, refused to go any further. On Thursday night, the search team made camp at the edge of the hollow, planning to continue looking at first light. But sometime during the night, they heard it. The singing Wade had described, but louder now, more complex, with harmonies that seemed to come from the ground itself. The sound went on for hours, rising and falling like a tide, and in the morning, 2 of the searchers were gone. The remaining team members found their sleeping bags empty, no sign of struggle, no tracks leading away from the camp. It was like they'd simply vanished in the night, called away by voices that promised things no human being should want to hear. The search was called off that afternoon. The state police sealed the access road and posted signs warning people to stay away from the area. Officially, it was due to unstable geological conditions and potential hazardous materials from old mining operations. But the real reason was that too many people had gone missing, and nobody wanted to explain to the families how you lose experienced search and rescue personnel in broad daylight. The hollow behind Blood Ridge has been quiet ever since, at least on the surface. The logging lease was never renewed, and the timber company wrote off their equipment as a total loss. The access road grew over with weeds and brambles, and the warning signs faded and fell down. But sometimes on still autumn nights when the air is heavy and the leaves are turning, you can still hear it if you know how to listen. The Cherokee had a word for it. They called it the hunger that walks. But I think it's older than that, older than the Cherokee, older than the mountains themselves. Something that was here before the first tree took root, before the first stream carved its way down to the valley, something that's been waiting in the deep places of the world for longer than human memory can reach. And if you're still listening to this, maybe you'll think twice before heading into those woods alone, especially when the leaves are turning and the air gets that heavy, expectant feel. Because some places aren't meant for human feet, and some hungers can never be satisfied, no matter how much they're fed. I'm an old man now, well past 70, and I've spent the last 30 years trying to forget what happened in that hollow behind Blood Ridge. But every October, when the leaves start to turn and the air gets that familiar weight, I remember Wade's stubborn grin and June's bright eyes, and I wonder if they're still out there somewhere, singing in harmonies that no human throat was ever meant to make. The woods are quiet now, but it's not the peaceful quiet of nature at rest. It's the quiet of something sleeping, something that's been fed well enough to rest for a while but might wake up hungry again someday. And when it does, God help whoever happens to be walking through those mountains when the singing starts. Some things are better left alone, buried deep in the hollows where they belong. But every now and then, when the mist rolls in thick and the shadows grow long, I think I can still hear them calling. Wade and June and all the others who went too far into the dark places of the world and never found their way back out. The hollow behind Blood Ridge is still there, waiting. And I pray to God it always will be, because the day that hunger finally gets tired of singing to itself and decides to come down to where the people live, that's the day the mountains themselves will wish they'd never been born. You know, there are some stories that sit in your chest like a stone, growing heavier with each passing year. Stories that make you second-guess every shadow, every unexplained sound in the night. Stories that change the way you look at familiar places, turning comfort into something cold and watchful. This is one of those stories. Before I tell you what happened in Maiden's Hollow back in 1987, I need you to understand something. The mountains don't forget. They hold on to things, memories, secrets, voices that should have gone quiet long ago. And sometimes when the conditions are just right, when the mist rolls in thick and the air gets that particular weight to it, those things come back. I've lived in these West Virginia hills for 73 years now, and I've learned to read the mountains' moods like other folks read the weather. But what happened that autumn, what I witnessed and what I failed to stop, that taught me there are some things the mountains know that we were never meant to learn. So if you're the type who needs your world to make sense, who needs everything wrapped up neat and tidy, you might want to stop listening now. Because what I'm about to tell you doesn't have explanations, doesn't have comfortable answers. It just has the truth raw and jagged as a broken coal seam. The first thing you need to know is that Maiden's Hollow wasn't always called that. The old Cherokee who used to hunt these ridges before the white settlers came, they called it something else, a word that meant the place where voices carry too far. The miners who carved up these mountains in the 1920s, they had their own name for it, Dead Man's Gulch. But by the time I was born, folks had settled on Maiden's Hollow, though nobody could quite remember why. It was a narrow cut between two steep ridges, maybe 3 miles long, with Birch Creek running down the middle like a silver thread. The old mining road wound up one side, mostly overgrown by the 80s, leading to the abandoned Consolidated Coal Company shafts that had been sealed up after the cave-in of 1952. 7 men died in that collapse, and their bodies never were recovered. The company just poured concrete over the entrance and walked away, leaving the families to grieve over empty graves. On the other side of the hollow stood the remnants of what used to be a logging camp, a few rotting cabins, a collapsed commissary, and the skeletal frame of an old sawmill. And at the very head of the hollow, where the creek bubbled up from underground springs, there was a little white church that hadn't seen a congregation in 20 years. The Maiden's Hollow Baptist Church, with its broken windows and sagging roof, still had the old cemetery out back where the headstones leaned like crooked teeth. Now, I need to tell you about the people who were there that October, because understanding them is the only way you'll understand what happened. These weren't strangers to me. They were my neighbors, my family, people I'd known since they were babies. That's what made it so much worse. There was my nephew Danny, just 17 that fall, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubborn streak. Danny was the kind of boy who'd always been drawn to the old places, the forgotten corners of the mountains where most folks knew better than to go. He collected stories the way other kids collected baseball cards, always pestering the old-timers about mining disasters and logging accidents, about the families who'd just up and vanished one day, leaving their suppers on the table. His grandmother, my sister Rose, used to worry that the boy was too fascinated with death, but I thought it was just natural curiosity. I wish now I'd listened to Rose. Then there was Sarah Beth Collins, 16 and pretty as a spring morning, with long auburn hair that caught the light like fire. She was Danny's girlfriend, though her parents didn't much approve of the match. The Collins family had money. They owned the hardware store in town and a good piece of bottom land along the main creek. They thought their daughter could do better than a boy whose daddy worked maintenance at the power plant. Sarah Beth was sweet-natured but headstrong, the kind of girl who'd follow her heart even if it led her over a cliff. Marcus Webb was the third member of their little group, a year older than Danny and built like a linebacker despite never playing football. Marcus was what we called different. Not slow exactly, but something in his wiring wasn't quite the same as other folks. He'd been held back twice in school, not because he couldn't learn, but because he saw things others didn't, heard connections that weren't there. His family had a long history of what polite people called eccentricity, and what others whispered was closer to madness. But Marcus was gentle as a lamb, and he'd been Danny's best friend since they were in diapers. The fourth one was Jenny Mathis, a year younger than the rest but wise beyond her years in the way that mountain children often are. Jenny was what we called a knowing child. She could predict weather changes in her bones, could tell when someone was fixing to die just by looking at them. Her grandmother had been the same way, and her great-grandmother before that. It was a gift that ran in the women of her family, though they didn't always consider it a blessing. Jenny was quiet and watchful, with pale green eyes that seemed to see right through to the back of your soul. And finally, there was Tommy Briggs, barely 15, but already carrying himself like a man. Tommy's father had been killed in a mining accident 3 years prior, and the boy had taken on the responsibility of caring for his mother and 2 younger sisters. He worked weekends at the grocery store and spent his evenings splitting firewood or fixing whatever needed fixing around their small house. Tommy was responsible and serious, not given to flights of fancy or risky behavior. That's why what happened was so shocking, because Tommy was the one who should have known better, should have been the voice of reason. I was 61 that autumn, living alone in the house where I'd been born, about 2 miles from the mouth of Maiden's Hollow. I'd never married, never had children of my own, but I'd helped raise most of the young folks in the area. They called me Uncle Ezra, and I took that title seriously. I kept an eye on things, made sure the young people didn't get into too much trouble, and I knew the mountains like the back of my weathered hand. It was the 3rd week of October when everything started going wrong. The leaves were at their peak, painting the ridges in shades of gold and crimson that took your breath away. But there was something else in the air that week, something that made the hair on your arm stand up and the dogs whine for no reason. The old-timers called it the restless time, when the barrier between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond gets thin as tissue paper. I first noticed it on a Tuesday morning when I was checking my rabbit traps up on Pine Ridge. The woods were too quiet. No squirrels chattering, no birds calling, just an unnatural stillness that pressed against your eardrums like deep water. And there was a smell, faint but unmistakable, like old flowers and damp earth, like a funeral parlor that hadn't been aired out in years. But the real sign that something was amiss came from the animals. My old blue-tick hound, Gus, who'd never been afraid of anything in his 12 years, suddenly refused to go near the path that led toward Maiden's Hollow. He'd whine and pull backward on his chain, his hackles raised and his eyes showing white around the edges. The cattle in Morrison's pasture, which bordered the hollow, had all gathered at the far end of the field, as far from the tree line as they could get, and Mrs. Henderson's cats, all 6 of them, had disappeared overnight without a trace. I should have paid more attention to those warnings. Should have known that when the animals start acting strange, it's time for people to be extra careful. But I was too concerned with practical matters, the approaching winter, the repairs needed on my roof, the dozen small emergencies that make up daily life in the mountains. I didn't have time for superstition. That Wednesday evening, I was sitting on my porch watching the sun set behind the western ridge, when I saw the 5 of them walking down the old logging road that led to Maiden's Hollow. They were moving with purpose, carrying backpacks and what looked like camping gear. Danny was leading the group, his dark hair catching the last light, with Sarah Beth close beside him. Marcus lumbered along behind them, his massive frame making the others look like children. Jenny walked a little apart from the group, her head tilted as if she were listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear, and Tommy brought up the rear, his young face set in lines of determination. I called out to them, asked where they were headed, but they were too far away to hear me clearly. Or maybe they chose not to answer. I watched them disappear into the trees at the mouth of the hollow, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. Later, I would learn that they'd been planning this expedition for weeks. Danny had been researching the history of Maiden's Hollow, digging through old newspaper archives and talking to anyone who'd listen about the strange things that had happened there over the years. He'd become obsessed with the story of the Whitmore family, who'd lived in a cabin up in the hollow back in the 1930s. The Whitmores had been a young couple with 2 small children, trying to scratch out a living on a hardscrabble farm in the shadow of the mining operation. They'd been there for 3 years, keeping to themselves mostly, when one day in November of 1934, they just vanished. The neighbors found their door standing open, their breakfast still on the table, the children's toys scattered in the yard. Their cow was still in the barn, lowing with hunger, and the chickens were loose in the vegetable garden. But of the family themselves, there was no sign. The sheriff organized search parties, and they combed every inch of the hollow for days. They found no bodies, no signs of violence, no clues about what might have happened. It was as if the earth had simply opened up and swallowed them whole. The case was never solved, and eventually people stopped talking about it. But the stories lingered, the way mountain stories do, passed down from generation to generation like a curse. Danny had convinced the others that they could solve the mystery, that with modern camping equipment and systematic searching, they could find some clue that the searchers of 1934 had missed. It was the kind of adventure that appealed to teenagers, a chance to be heroes, to succeed where adults had failed. Sarah Beth had been excited by the romantic notion of solving an old mystery with her boyfriend. Marcus had simply wanted to go wherever Danny went. Jenny had tried to talk them out of it, said the hollow felt wrong to her, but she'd been outvoted, and Tommy had insisted on coming along to keep an eye on the younger ones. They set up camp that Wednesday night in the ruins of the old Whitmore cabin, or what was left of it. The foundation stones were still there, along with the remnants of a stone chimney and a few rotting logs. It was maybe half a mile up the hollow from the creek, on a little rise that gave a good view of the surrounding hills. Danny had done his research. He knew exactly where the family had lived, had even found an old photograph of the cabin in its prime. I didn't see them again until Friday morning, when Jenny came stumbling down the mountain path like something was chasing her. She was pale as milk, her clothes torn and dirty, her eyes wild with terror. She collapsed on my porch, shaking so hard her teeth chattered, and it was 20 minutes before I could get a coherent word out of her. When she finally managed to speak, her voice was barely above a whisper. She told me they'd been hearing things since the first night, voices calling their names from the darkness, footsteps circling their camp, whispers that seemed to come from the ground itself. Marcus had been the first to start acting strange, talking to people who weren't there, laughing at jokes no one else could hear. By Thursday night, he was carrying on full conversations with invisible companions, and his eyes had taken on a distant, glassy quality that made the others nervous. But it was what happened Thursday night that had sent Jenny running. She'd been awakened by the sound of singing, a woman's voice, clear and beautiful, rising from somewhere near the old cemetery. The melody was unfamiliar, but the words were clear enough, a lullaby about sleeping children and peaceful dreams. One by one, the others had gotten up and started walking toward the sound, moving like sleepwalkers, their faces blank and serene. Jenny had followed them, staying back in the shadows, watching in growing horror as they approached the cemetery. The singing was coming from the old church, though the building had been empty for decades. And there, standing in the doorway with arms outstretched, was the figure of a woman in a white dress. But it wasn't quite right, Jenny said. The woman's face was too pale, her smile too wide, and her eyes were black as coal, reflecting the moonlight like polished stones. She was beautiful and terrible at the same time, the kind of beauty that made you want to run toward it and away from it all at once. The woman had called to them, her voice sweet as honey, welcoming them home. And one by one, Danny, Sarah Beth, Marcus, and Tommy had walked toward her, their movements slow and dreamy, their faces filled with a terrible joy. They disappeared into the church, and Jenny had heard their voices joining the woman's song, harmonizing in a way that made her skin crawl. Jenny had run then, crashing through the underbrush in the darkness, branches tearing at her clothes and face. She'd run all through the night, not stopping until she reached my porch, and even then she kept looking over her shoulder as if something might be following her. I wanted to dismiss her story as teenage imagination, the kind of tale that grows in the telling, but there was something in her eyes, a haunted quality that spoke of genuine terror. And there was the fact that she'd left her friends behind, something the Jenny I knew would never do unless she had no choice. I loaded my shotgun and gathered up what supplies I could carry: flashlights, rope, a first aid kit, and a thermos of coffee. I'd known these mountains all my life, had walked every trail and explored every hollow. If there were kids in trouble up there, I was going to find them and bring them home. The walk up to Maiden's Hollow took me an hour, following the old logging road that wound between the ridges. The woods were still unnaturally quiet, and the air had that same funeral smell I'd noticed earlier in the week. Gus had refused to come with me, something that had never happened before in all our years together. I found their campsite easily enough, a scatter of tents and sleeping bags in the ruins of the old cabin. Their gear was still there, but there was no sign of the kids themselves. The embers of their campfire were cold, and a pot of what looked like soup had been left to congeal on the camp stove. It was as if they'd simply gotten up and walked away in the middle of dinner. I called their names, my voice echoing off the surrounding ridges, but there was no answer. Not even an echo seemed to come back right. The sound was muffled, distorted, as if the air itself was swallowing it. That's when I noticed the tracks. They led away from the camp in a straight line, heading toward the head of the hollow where the old church stood. 4 sets of footprints, clearly defined in the soft earth. Danny's worn sneakers, Sarah Beth's hiking boots, Marcus's heavy work boots, and Tommy's ragged tennis shoes. They walked in single file, evenly spaced, with no sign of hurry or struggle. I followed the trail, my heart pounding harder with each step. The footprints led through a stand of ancient oaks, their trunks so massive you could have driven a truck between them. The trees here were older than the mountains themselves, their branches twisted into shapes that hurt to look at too closely. And carved into the bark of the largest oak, so old the letters were barely visible, was a single word: Maiden. The trail led past the ruins of the old sawmill, where rusted machinery poked through the undergrowth like the bones of some enormous beast. The air grew thicker as I climbed, pregnant with moisture and that underlying smell of decay. And somewhere ahead, just at the edge of hearing, I could swear I heard the sound of singing. The cemetery came into view as I crested a small rise, the weathered headstones leaning at drunken angles among the weeds. Some of the graves were so old that the inscriptions had been worn away by decades of mountain weather, leaving only blank stone sentinels watching over forgotten bones. But it was the church itself that drew my attention, or rather, the light that spilled from its windows. The Maiden's Hollow Baptist Church had been dark for 20 years, its windows boarded up and its doors chained shut. But now golden light poured from every opening, warm and inviting, and I could hear voices inside raised in song. It was a hymn I recognized from my childhood, one my mother used to sing while she worked in the kitchen, but the words were different somehow, changed in ways that made my skin crawl. I approached the building slowly, my shotgun held ready, though I wasn't sure what I was planning to shoot. The closer I got, the more details I could make out. The windows weren't boarded up anymore. They were clean and whole, as if the church had been restored to its former glory. The doors stood open, and I could see people inside, their silhouettes moving in the golden light. I crept closer, keeping to the shadows, until I could peer through one of the side windows. What I saw inside made my blood run cold. The church was full of people, but they weren't quite right. Their clothes were from different eras, mining families from the 1920s, loggers from the 1940s, farmers from the 1960s, men, women, and children, all dressed in their Sunday best, all singing in perfect harmony. Their faces were pale and waxy, their eyes reflecting the candlelight like mirrors. And at the front of the church, leading the congregation in song, was a woman in a white wedding dress. She was beautiful in the way that winter storms are beautiful, terrible and perfect and absolutely deadly. Her hair was long and black, flowing around her shoulders like dark water. Her dress was made of some fabric that seemed to shift and flow, even when she stood still. And when she smiled, her teeth were white as fresh snow and sharp as broken glass. But it was her eyes that held my attention, black as coal and older than the mountains themselves. They were the eyes of something that had never been human, something that had learned to wear human shape but hadn't quite mastered the art of human expression. And when her gaze swept across the congregation, I saw the people lean toward her like flowers turning toward the sun. Danny was there in the front pew, his young face slack with adoration. Sarah Beth sat beside him, her auburn hair gleaming in the candlelight, her mouth moving in silent song. Marcus was in the row behind them, his massive frame somehow diminished, his eyes fixed on the woman in white with an expression of vacant joy. And Tommy was at the end of the pew, his serious face transformed by a smile that looked almost painful. They were all there, all the people who disappeared from Maiden's Hollow over the decades. The Whitmore family sat in the third pew, their children no older than they'd been the day they vanished. The 7 miners who died in the cave-in were there too, their faces still blackened with coal dust, their work clothes somehow cleaned and pressed. Generation after generation of the lost and the forgotten, all gathered in that impossible church to worship something that should never have existed. The woman in white raised her arms, and the singing grew louder, more urgent. The voices blended together until they sounded like wind through the trees, like water over stones, like the mountain itself giving voice to secrets it had kept for centuries. And as she sang, I could see the congregation growing more translucent, as if they were fading away even as I watched. That's when I understood what I was seeing. This wasn't a church service. It was a harvest. The woman in white wasn't leading them in worship. She was collecting them, gathering up their souls the way a farmer gathers grain. And my nephew Danny, sweet Sarah Beth, gentle Marcus, and responsible Tommy were about to become part of her eternal congregation. I don't know what came over me in that moment. Maybe it was love for those children. Maybe it was fury at what was being done to them. Maybe it was just the stubborn mountain pride that says you don't give up without a fight. Whatever it was, I found myself charging through the church doors, my shotgun raised, my voice roaring their names. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The congregation turned to look at me, and their faces were no longer human. They were hollow, empty, nothing but shadow and longing shaped into the memory of people. The woman in white opened her mouth and let out a sound that was part scream, part wind, part music played on instruments of bone and sinew. The building began to shake around us, the walls rippling like water, the floor tilting beneath my feet. The golden light flickered and dimmed, and I could see the church as it really was. Rotting beams, broken windows, floorboards soft with decades of rain and neglect. But the congregation was still there, still singing, still reaching toward the woman in white with desperate hunger. I fired my shotgun into the air, the sound deafening in the confined space. The congregation scattered like smoke, their forms dissolving into wisps of mist that swirled around the rafters. But the woman in white remained, her black eyes fixed on me with an expression of amused contempt. She spoke then, her voice echoing from everywhere and nowhere, words that seemed to bypass my ears and speak directly to my soul. She told me I was too late, that the children had already chosen their fate, that they belonged to her now, just as all the others had belonged to her. She told me about the loneliness of the mountains, about the hunger that lived in the deep places, about the bargains that had been made long before my grandfather's grandfather was born, and then she began to sing again, her voice weaving a spell that made my knees weak and my vision blur. I felt the urge to lay down my gun, to walk forward and join the congregation, to let her voice wash away all the pain and worry and responsibility that came with being human. It would be so easy, so peaceful, to just let go and become part of something larger than myself. But then I heard another voice, thin and frightened, calling my name. It was Tommy, and he was fighting the spell, his young face twisted with effort as he tried to resist the woman's power. His voice broke the enchantment, and I found myself able to move again. I grabbed him by the shoulders and shook him, calling his name over and over until his eyes focused on mine. One by one, the others began to wake up as well. Danny blinking in confusion, Sarah Beth gasping as if she'd been underwater, Marcus looking around with the lost expression of a child awakening from a nightmare. The woman in white shrieked again, and this time the sound was pure rage. The church began to collapse around us, beams falling and walls crumbling. I pushed the kids toward the door, shouting at them to run, to get out, to not look back no matter what they heard behind them. We stumbled out into the night, the five of us, and ran through the cemetery as the church came down behind us. The sound was like thunder, like the mountain itself was screaming. When we finally stopped running and looked back, there was nothing there but ruins and shadows, the same broken-down church that had been there for 20 years. But the woman's voice followed us as we fled, promising that we could never really leave, that we would always be part of her congregation, that one day we would return to finish what we'd started. And in the years that followed, I began to understand what she meant. Danny was never quite the same after that night. He became obsessed with the woman in white, spending hours researching Cherokee legends and mountain folklore, trying to understand what he'd encountered. He found references to her in old stories, the Maiden of the Hollow. They called her a spirit that had been bound to the land before the first white settlers arrived. She was said to be the ghost of a Cherokee woman who died defending her people's sacred places, transformed by grief and rage into something that fed on the loneliness and desperation of others. But the stories were incomplete, fragments passed down through generations of people who'd been afraid to speak her name. What we'd experienced that night in the church was older and more terrible than any legend could capture. She wasn't just a ghost, she was the hollow itself, the emptiness that lived in the spaces between the mountains, the hunger that drew people to disappear into the wilderness and never return. Sarah Beth tried to put it behind her, to pretend it had all been some kind of shared hallucination. She went away to college, married a lawyer from Charleston, and moved to the city, but she never came back to visit, never brought her children to see the mountains where she'd grown up. And sometimes, on quiet nights, I'd get a phone call from her, just to hear a familiar voice, to remind herself that the world beyond the hollow was still real. Marcus was the worst affected. The experience had damaged something in his mind, left him even more disconnected from reality than before. He would disappear for days at a time, wandering the mountains, and when he returned, he'd speak of conversations with people who weren't there, of invitations to join eternal celebrations. His family finally had to send him to a facility in Morgantown, where he lived quietly for the rest of his days, painting pictures of a woman in white who stood in the doorway of a church that didn't exist. Tommy threw himself into his responsibilities with even more determination than before, as if hard work could wash away the memory of what he'd seen. He took care of his mother and sisters, worked his way through college, and became a teacher. But he never married, never had children of his own. He said once that he didn't want to bring new life into a world where such things were possible. And Jenny, the one who'd saved them all by running for help, developed a reputation as a seer and a healer. People came to her from all over the county, seeking advice and comfort, and she helped them as best she could. But she never spoke of what she'd experienced in the hollow, never told anyone about the woman in white or the congregation of the lost. Some knowledge, she said, was too dangerous to share. As for me, I've carried the burden of that night for 37 years now. I've watched the hollow carefully, checking on it regularly, making sure that the woman in white hasn't returned. The old church remains in ruins, just as it was before, but sometimes on foggy nights I can see lights moving among the headstones, and I know she's still there, still waiting. 3 of those children are gone now. Danny died in a car accident in 1995. Sarah Beth passed from cancer in 2008, and Tommy had a heart attack just last year. Only Jenny and I remain, 2 old people who share a secret that grows heavier with each passing year. But here's the thing that keeps me awake at night. The thing that makes me question everything I thought I knew about the world. In all my research, in all my conversations with the old-timers, I've never found any record of a Cherokee woman who could match the description of the thing we encountered. The stories about the Maiden of the Hollow, they're all wrong, all incomplete. They're just fragments of a larger truth that people have been too afraid to speak. I think she's something older than the Cherokee, older than any human presence in these mountains. She's the loneliness itself, the empty spaces between the trees, the silence that falls when the last human voice grows still. She's been here since the first creatures walked these ridges, and she'll be here long after the last human footprint has been washed away by rain, and I think she's growing stronger. The mountains are emptying out as young people move to the cities, as the old ways die out and the stories are forgotten. The hollow places are growing larger, the silence deeper, and in that silence she waits, patient as stone, gathering her strength for the day when the last human voice falls silent and the mountains belong to her alone. Sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick and the air gets that particular weight to it, I can hear her singing. It's faint, like a radio station from very far away, but it's there. And I know that someday, when I'm older and weaker and more tired than I am now, I'll find myself walking up that old logging road toward Maiden's Hollow. I'll walk through the cemetery and up to the ruins of the church, and I'll find the doors standing open and the lights burning bright inside. And when that day comes, I'll take my place in the congregation, and I'll sing along with all the others who've gone before me. Because in the end, that's what she offers. Not death, but belonging. Not silence, but a song that goes on forever. And after carrying the weight of that night for so many years, the thought of laying down the burden and joining that eternal choir doesn't seem so terrible anymore. But until that day comes, I'll keep watching. I'll keep the secret and tend the memory, and I'll make sure that no more children wander up into Maiden's Hollow looking for adventure. Because some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some doors are better left unopened. The woman in white is still there, still waiting, still singing her beautiful, terrible song. And someday, when the mountains are empty, and the last human voice has fallen silent, she'll step out of the hollow and claim the world that was always meant to be hers. So, if you ever find yourself driving through the mountains of West Virginia and you see a narrow road winding up between 2 steep ridges, don't follow it. If you hear singing coming from the deep woods, don't listen. And if you ever find yourself in a place where the silence is so complete that you can hear your own heartbeat, turn around and leave as fast as you can. Because the mountains remember everything, and some things they remember are better left forgotten. The woman in white is still singing, still waiting, still calling for others to join her congregation. And someday, when the conditions are just right, when the mist rolls in thick and the air gets that particular weight to it, she'll find new voices to add to her choir. I just pray that when that day comes, you're not one of them. There are some memories that refuse to stay buried, no matter how deep you dig the grave. I've spent 43 years trying to forget what happened in the summer of 1987, but the older I get, the clearer it becomes. Like fog lifting off a holler at dawn, revealing shapes you wish had stayed hidden. If you're the type who believes that some secrets are meant to stay in the ground, you might want to stop reading now. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't just a story, it's a warning about what happens when we forget the old ways, and why our grandparents whispered certain names only in daylight. My name is Earl Whitmore, and I'm 79 years old. I've lived in these Kentucky mountains my entire life, watched coal towns rise and fall like summer storms, seen families scattered to the wind when the mines closed. But nothing prepared me for what I witnessed that August, when 5 young people decided to camp in a place that had been marked off limits for over a century. They thought they were just exploring. They had no idea they were walking into a trap that had been waiting patiently for fresh blood. The first time I saw Cassie, she was arguing with her boyfriend outside Henderson's general store, her red hair catching the afternoon sun like copper wire. She was 22 then, just graduated from Eastern Kentucky University with some degree in anthropology or folklore. One of those subjects that sounds impressive but doesn't put food on the table. Cassie had grown up in Lexington, but her grandmother had been born in these mountains, and she'd spent summers here as a child, listening to the old women tell stories on front porches that sagged under the weight of decades. What made Cassie different from the other college kids who occasionally wandered through our town was her genuine respect for the mountain ways. She didn't mock the superstitions or laugh at the old-timers who still hung iron horseshoes above their doors. Instead, she collected their stories like pressed flowers, writing them down in a leather journal she carried everywhere. I remember thinking she was too curious for her own good, the way she'd ask questions that made folks uncomfortable, probing into family histories that some preferred to keep buried. Her boyfriend Marcus couldn't have been more different. He was 24, tall and lean, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from never having to worry about where your next meal is coming from. His father owned a chain of hardware stores across central Kentucky, and Marcus had that restless energy of someone who'd never had to work with his hands. He'd followed Cassie up to the mountains because he was smitten with her, but you could see in his eyes that he thought the whole place was backwards and quaint. He had a way of smiling when locals talked about old beliefs, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Then there was Derek, Marcus's younger brother, 19 and built like a linebacker. Derek had flunked out of college after one semester and was working construction, but he still had that teenager's sense of invincibility. He was the type who'd dare you to walk through a graveyard at midnight, not because he was brave, but because he genuinely didn't believe anything bad could happen to him. I watched him crush beer cans against his forehead outside the diner, laughing too loud and trying to impress Sarah, who was clearly out of his league. Sarah was 21, with dark hair and intelligent eyes that reminded me of my own daughter at that age. She was studying pre-med at the University of Louisville, serious and focused in a way that made the boys treat her with a mixture of respect and nervous energy. She'd grown up in the suburbs of Louisville, but she didn't look down on mountain folk the way Marcus did. Instead, she seemed genuinely interested in the medicinal plants that grew wild in these hills, the old remedies that had been passed down through generations. She had a quiet strength about her, the kind of person who would stay calm in a crisis. The fifth member of their group was Tommy, though I didn't learn his name until later. He was 23, a photography student from somewhere up north, Ohio or Pennsylvania, I think. Tommy was the quiet one, always hanging back with his camera, documenting everything. He had that pale, urban look of someone who spent too much time indoors, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he understood more than he let on. He reminded me of myself at that age, before I learned that some things are better left unrecorded. They'd come to Whisper Creek to explore what Cassie called authentic Appalachian culture, though what they really meant was they wanted to find the most isolated, backwards place they could and treat it like a living museum. They'd rented a couple of rooms at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, the only place in town that took outsiders, and spent their days hiking the old logging roads and interviewing anyone who'd talk to them about local history. I should have known they were heading for trouble when I saw them studying the old survey map in the town library. It was one of those hand-drawn maps from the 1890s, the kind that showed every cabin and creek, every family cemetery and hunting trail. Most of the places marked on that map were long gone, reclaimed by the forest or washed away by flash floods. But there was one area that had been deliberately scratched out, a section up near Bone Ridge where someone had taken a knife to the paper, scraping away the details until only blank space remained. When I saw Cassie running her finger over that damaged section, I knew I should have spoken up. But you have to understand, by 1987, most of us old-timers had learned to keep our mouths shut around outsiders. Too many times we'd tried to warn people away from certain places, only to have them laugh at our superstitions and do exactly what we'd told them not to do. So instead of warning them about Bone Ridge, I watched them pack their camping gear and disappear into the mountains, knowing in my bones that not all of them would come back. The reason that section of the map had been scratched out wasn't because of any government secret or mining claim. It was because the man who drew that map, my great-grandfather Silas Whitmore, had been one of the last people to escape from Bone Ridge alive. He'd spent the rest of his life trying to make sure nobody else would make the same mistake he had, but he also knew that simply telling people to stay away would only make them more curious. So he'd taken the more direct approach. He'd tried to erase the place from existence, at least on paper. Bone Ridge got its name from the Cherokee who used to hunt these mountains before the white settlers arrived. According to the stories passed down through my family, it was a place where the dead refused to rest, where the bones of the ancient ones sang in the wind. The Cherokee had marked it as forbidden ground, a place where the boundary between the living world and the spirit world had worn thin. But like most sacred warnings, it was treated as mere superstition by the European settlers who began clearing the forests in the 1800s. The first white family to build a homestead on Bone Ridge was the Kellermans, German immigrants who'd come to Kentucky looking for farmland. They'd cleared a section of the ridge and built a cabin, planted crops, started raising livestock. For a few months, everything seemed normal. Then the children started disappearing. Not all at once, mind you. That would have been too obvious. First, it was the youngest Kellerman boy, 3-year-old Hans, who vanished from his bed one night without a trace. Then the neighbor's daughter, little Mary Hutchins, who went missing while picking berries. Each time, search parties combed the mountains for days, but they never found so much as a torn piece of clothing or a single footprint. The children had simply vanished, as if the earth itself had swallowed them. The adults started next. Old Herman Kellerman, the patriarch who'd first settled the ridge, began talking about voices in the wind. He'd sit on his porch at night, listening to what he swore were his dead children calling to him from the forest. His wife Emma started sleepwalking, and twice they found her standing at the edge of the ridge in her nightgown, staring down into the valley with empty eyes. By the time my great-grandfather Silas arrived on Bone Ridge in 1889, only 3 families remained. He was working as a surveyor for the state, mapping the mountain regions for timber companies, and he'd been hired to chart the ridge for a potential logging operation. What he found there changed him forever. The first thing Silas noticed was the silence. Not the normal quiet of deep forest, but an absolute absence of sound that made his ears ring. No birds, no insects, no wind through the trees. Even his own footsteps seemed muffled, as if the air itself was too thick to carry sound properly. The second thing he noticed was the bones. They weren't human bones, at least not entirely. Scattered throughout the forest around the abandoned homesteads were the remains of animals, deer, rabbits, squirrels, but they'd been arranged in patterns that suggested intelligence, circles and spirals, geometric shapes that seemed to pulse with their own dark rhythm. And in the center of each arrangement, something that might have been a child's finger bone, or a piece of carved wood, or something else entirely. Silas had grown up hearing the old stories, the warnings passed down from his Cherokee grandmother about places where the dead walked and the living were not welcome. But he was a practical man, a surveyor who believed in measurement and evidence. So he made camp on the ridge, determined to complete his work despite the growing sense of unease that followed him like a shadow. On his second night, he heard them. The singing started just after midnight, a low humming that seemed to come from beneath the ground itself. At first, Silas thought it might be wind through underground caves, but the sound had a rhythmic quality that suggested voices. Human voices, but changed somehow, hollowed out and stretched until they barely resembled anything living. He lay in his bedroll, listening to the bone singers perform their ancient lullaby, and slowly began to understand what had happened to the missing children. They hadn't been killed or kidnapped. They'd been transformed, their young voices added to the chorus that had been growing stronger with each passing year. The ridge was hungry, and it fed on innocence, on the pure hearts of children who hadn't yet learned to fear the darkness. But the bone singers weren't content with just children anymore. They'd grown bold, their appetites expanding to include anyone who dared to set foot on their sacred ground. Silas could feel them calling to him, promising rest and peace and an end to the loneliness that had plagued him since his wife's death. The temptation was almost overwhelming. the desire to simply walk into the forest and join the eternal song. He managed to resist until dawn, then packed his gear and fled the ridge as fast as his legs would carry him. But he could hear them following, their voices growing louder and more insistent with each step. They pursued him for 3 days, through creek beds and over rocky slopes, their song echoing off the mountain faces until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. When Silas finally reached the valley and the relative safety of civilization, he was changed. His hair had gone white overnight, and his eyes held a haunted quality that never fully faded. He completed his survey, but instead of reporting the ridge as suitable for logging, he marked it as unstable ground, prone to landslides and flash floods. Then he took his hand-drawn map and carefully scratched out every detail that might help someone else find their way to Bone Ridge. For the next 40 years, until his death in 1929, Silas Whitmore never spoke about what he'd experienced on that ridge. But he passed the knowledge down to his son, my grandfather, who passed it to my father, who eventually shared it with me. Each generation sworn to keep the secret, to make sure that Bone Ridge remained forgotten and untouched. We thought we'd succeeded. For nearly a century, the ridge had been left alone, slowly erased from maps and memory. The old logging roads that led to it had been reclaimed by the forest, and the few locals who still knew about it understood that it was a place to be avoided. But we'd underestimated the power of curiosity, the way young people are drawn to forbidden places like moths to flame. I first realized something was wrong when I saw the smoke. It was a Tuesday evening in late August, and I was sitting on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sunset behind the ridge line. The air was thick with humidity, the kind of oppressive heat that made your clothes stick to your skin and your thoughts feel sluggish. I'd been half dozing when I noticed a thin column of smoke rising from the direction of Bone Ridge, barely visible against the darkening sky. My first thought was forest fire, but the smoke was too controlled, too deliberate. Someone had lit a campfire up there, which meant that someone had found their way to the forbidden ground. I felt a chill run down my spine despite the heat, and I knew with absolute certainty that it was those 5 young people from the boarding house. I should have called the sheriff, but what would I have told him? That some college kids were camping in a place that my great-grandfather had marked as haunted? That they were in danger from something that most people would dismiss as mountain superstition? Instead, I sat on my porch and watched that smoke rise into the night sky, praying that they would have the sense to leave before dark. But the smoke kept rising, and I knew they weren't going anywhere. Around midnight, I heard the singing start. It was faint at first, carried on the wind like a half-remembered melody. But as the night wore on, it grew stronger, more insistent. I could make out individual voices now, the high, sweet tones of children mixed with deeper harmonies that seemed to come from somewhere far below the earth. The bone singers were welcoming new guests, and they were hungry. I tried to convince myself that it was just the wind, just the sound of air moving through the hollow spaces in the mountain. But I knew better. I'd heard the stories, passed down through 4 generations of my family, and I understood what was happening up on that ridge. The question was whether those 5 young people would understand it in time to save themselves. The singing continued until dawn, then faded as the sun rose over the mountains. I waited through the morning, hoping to see them come down from the ridge, but the old logging road remained empty. By afternoon, I couldn't stand it anymore. I loaded my shotgun, though I knew it would be useless against what they were facing, and started the long climb up to Bone Ridge. The path was harder to follow than I'd expected. 40 years of neglect had allowed the forest to reclaim most of the old trail, and I had to push through tangles of blackberry vines and fallen trees. My knees weren't what they used to be, and more than once I considered turning back, but the memory of that smoke and the knowledge of what waited on the ridge kept me moving forward. The first sign that something was wrong came when I reached the creek that marked the boundary of the forbidden ground. The water was running black, not the clear mountain stream I remembered from my childhood, and the silence was absolute, just as my great-grandfather had described. No birds, no insects, no wind through the trees, just the sound of my own labored breathing and the crunch of dead leaves beneath my feet. I found their campsite in a clearing near the center of the ridge, where the Kellerman cabin had once stood. Their tents were still standing, their gear scattered around a cold fire pit. But there was no sign of the 5 young people, no indication of where they might have gone. It was as if they'd simply vanished, leaving behind only the empty shells of their temporary home. I called out their names, my voice echoing strangely in the unnatural quiet. Cassie, Marcus, Sarah. But there was no response, no sound except the gradual fading of my own voice. I walked through their campsite looking for clues, for any sign of what had happened to them. That's when I noticed the bones. They'd been arranged in a perfect circle around the fire pit, small animal bones interspersed with what looked like pieces of carved wood. But as I looked closer, I realized they weren't wood at all. They were old bones, ancient and yellowed, carved with symbols that seemed to shift and change when I looked directly at them. And in the center of the circle, 5 sleeping bags arranged like the points of a star. I was starting to understand what had happened when I heard the first voice. It was Sarah, I think, though her voice had a hollow quality that made it hard to be sure. She was singing, a wordless melody that seemed to come from somewhere deep underground. Then Marcus joined in, his voice harmonizing with hers in a way that made my skin crawl. One by one, the others added their voices to the chorus, until all 5 of them were singing in perfect unison. But they weren't singing from their campsite. The voices were coming from beneath the ground, from the spaces between the roots and rocks where the bone singers had always made their home. The 5 young people had been welcomed into the ancient chorus, their voices added to the eternal song that had been growing stronger for over a century. I ran then, crashing through the underbrush like a spooked deer. Behind me, the singing grew louder, more insistent. I could hear them calling my name now, their voices sweet and seductive, promising rest and peace and an end to the loneliness that comes with old age. The temptation was almost overwhelming, the desire to simply stop running and join the eternal song. But I kept moving, driven by the same terror that had sent my great-grandfather fleeing from this place nearly a century ago. The voices followed me down the mountain, growing fainter but never completely fading. Even now, sitting in my living room 43 years later, I can still hear them sometimes when the wind blows just right. The official search for the 5 missing campers lasted 3 weeks. The sheriff organized volunteer parties, brought in tracking dogs, even called in a helicopter from the state police. But they never found so much as a footprint or a torn piece of clothing. The 5 young people had simply vanished, as if they'd never existed at all. I kept my mouth shut during the search, though it nearly killed me. What could I have told them? That the missing campers had been claimed by ancient spirits, transformed into something that was no longer quite human. That they were still up there on the ridge, singing their wordless lullabies to the darkness. The searchers would have thought I was crazy, and maybe I was. Maybe the whole thing was just the delusion of an old man who'd spent too many years listening to ghost stories. But I know what I heard that night, and I know what I saw in that clearing. The bones arranged in their perfect circle, the sleeping bags positioned like an offering to something dark and hungry. And I know that somewhere up on Bone Ridge, 5 young voices are still adding their harmonies to a song that began long before the first white settlers arrived in these mountains. The boarding house closed not long after the disappearances. Mrs. Patterson couldn't handle the questions, the reporters, the constant reminders of what had happened to her last guests. She sold the property to a developer from Lexington, who planned to turn it into vacation condos. But somehow the project never got off the ground. The funding fell through, the permits were denied, and the old boarding house still sits empty, its windows boarded up and its porch sagging under the weight of neglect. These days, most people have forgotten about the 5 missing campers. The story made headlines for a while, but there were no bodies, no evidence of foul play, no satisfying conclusion to hold the public's attention. The families still hold out hope, I imagine, still believe that their children might return someday. But I know better. I know that they're still up there on the ridge, their voices growing stronger with each passing year, waiting for the next group of curious explorers to stumble into their eternal song. The old ways are dying in these mountains, forgotten by younger generations who've moved to the cities or lost themselves in the glow of television screens. The warnings that once kept people away from certain places have been dismissed as superstition, and the knowledge that protected our ancestors has been buried beneath layers of modern skepticism. But some things refuse to stay buried. Some hungers are too ancient to be satisfied by progress or technology. And somewhere up on Bone Ridge, in the spaces between the rocks and roots, the bone singers continue their eternal performance, their voices calling out across the mountains to anyone foolish enough to listen. I'm 79 years old now, and I won't be around much longer to keep the secret. My children live in other states. My grandchildren have never seen these mountains, and when I'm gone, there will be no one left to remember why certain places should be left alone. The knowledge will die with me, and Bone Ridge will become just another camping destination for young people looking for adventure in the wilderness. But maybe that's as it should be. Maybe every generation needs to learn certain lessons for themselves, to discover that some doors should never be opened and some songs should never be sung. Maybe the bone singers are just waiting patiently for the next group of voices to join their ancient chorus, adding their harmonies to a song that will continue long after the last human voice has fallen silent. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind blows down from the mountains, I can still hear them singing. 5 young voices, clear and sweet, mixed with the deeper harmonies of all those who came before. They're calling to me, promising rest and peace and an end to the burden of remembering. The temptation grows stronger with each passing year, and I wonder how much longer I can resist the song that has been waiting for me since that terrible night in 1987. But for now, I sit on my porch and listen to the mountains sing their ancient lullabies, and I try to forget the faces of 5 young people who thought they were just going camping in the Kentucky wilderness. I try to forget the sound of their voices joining the eternal chorus, and I try not to think about what will happen when the next group of curious explorers finds their way to Bone Ridge. Because they will find it sooner or later. They always do. And when they do, the bone singers will be waiting. I know this channel is usually about exploring abandoned places and urban legends, but today I want to share something different, something personal. My grandfather Daniel passed away last month, and while going through his things, I found this journal entry from 1992. It's about something that happened to him and his best friend Hugo in Clay County, West Virginia. Grandpa Daniel was the kind of man who never told tall tales. He was a coal miner for 37 years, fought in Vietnam, raised 4 kids. Not the type to make things up or embellish stories. But what he wrote in this journal, it stayed with me since I read it. He never talked about this stuff when he was alive, but I think maybe he wanted someone to know. So I'm sharing it with you all, exactly as he wrote it, to honor his memory. This is his story, in his own words. I'm writing this down because I need to get it out of my head, and because maybe someday someone ought to know what really happened up on Widow's Ridge that autumn. My hands are still shaking as I write this, 3 days later, and I keep looking out the window expecting to see that damned light flickering through the trees. It was October of '92, and the leaves were at their peak. You know how it gets in these mountains when the maples turn that deep blood red, and the oaks go golden yellow, like God himself took a paintbrush to the whole ridgeline. The air had that crisp bite to it that makes you want to pull on a wool sweater and sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the mist roll through the hollows at dawn. Hugo Brennan had been my best friend since we were both knee-high to a grasshopper. We'd grown up together in Clay County, hunting the same deer trails, fishing the same creeks, working the same coal seams when we got old enough. Hugo was the kind of man who could track a wounded buck through a thunderstorm or find his way home in a blizzard using nothing but the feel of the wind. The mountains were in his blood the way coal dust gets in your lungs, deep and permanent. That particular October, Hugo had been acting strange. Not strange in an obvious way, but in the way you notice when you've known someone for 40 years. He'd always been quiet, but now he was quieter. He'd always been thoughtful, but now he seemed to be thinking about something specific, something that was eating at him from the inside. When we'd sit on his porch after work, sharing a beer and watching the sunset behind the ridge, he'd stare off toward the mountains with this look in his eyes I'd never seen before, like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. The first time Hugo mentioned the lantern, I thought he was pulling my leg. We were sitting in Mabel's diner on a Tuesday morning, sharing a plate of biscuits and gravy before our shift at the mine. Hugo was stirring his coffee with that absent-minded way he had, not really seeing the cup, when he said it. He told me he'd been seeing a light up on the ridge at night. Not a house light or a campfire, but something else. Something that moved. He said it looked like an old oil lantern, the kind his grandmother used to carry to the outhouse before they got electricity. He'd been watching it for weeks, he said, from his bedroom window. It would appear just after midnight on the nights when the moon was dark, flickering between the trees like someone was walking the ridge line, searching for something. I asked him if he'd been drinking, and he gave me a look that could have melted steel. Hugo Brennan was many things, but he wasn't a drinker. Never had been. His father had been a mean drunk, and Hugo had sworn off the bottle before he was old enough to legally touch it. The thing about mountain folk is that we grow up with stories. Stories about things that live in the deep woods, things that don't like to be disturbed. Most of us learn to take them with a grain of salt, but we also learn not to dismiss them entirely. There are too many places in these mountains where the trees grow thick and the shadows stay dark even at noon. Too many hollows where the old-timers refuse to hunt, where the animals don't make any noise, where the very air feels thick and wrong. The story of the widow's lantern wasn't new to me. I'd heard it from my grandfather when I was a boy, and he'd heard it from his grandfather before him. The way the story goes, there was a woman named Eliza Hardwick who lived up on what we now call Widow's Ridge back in 1906. Her husband, Thomas, worked the coal mine down in the valley, one of those early operations that carved tunnels into the mountainside with nothing but picks and shovels and pure determination. Thomas Hardwick was supposed to come home on October 13th, 1906, but he never made it. There'd been a cave-in at the mine, and Thomas was trapped somewhere in the tunnels with 5 other men. The mine owners brought in crews from 3 counties to dig them out, but the mountain had shifted, and the tunnels were buried under tons of rock and earth. They never found the bodies. Eliza Hardwick refused to believe her husband was dead. Every night she'd take her oil lantern and walk the ridge above the mine, holding it high so Thomas could see it if he managed to dig his way out. She'd walk from sunset to sunrise, calling his name into the darkness, waiting for an answer that never came. He never hunted that ridge again. None of the old-timers did. They'd hunt every other mountain in the county, but never Widow's Ridge. There was an understanding among the mountain folk that some places were best left alone. But Hugo, God help him, was curious. He'd always been the type to poke at things that were better left alone, to ask questions that didn't need answering. When we were kids, he was the one who'd dare you to explore the old mine shafts or spend the night in the abandoned church. He had a hunger for mystery that most of us grew out of, but Hugo never did. The more he told me about the lantern, the more I could see it consuming him. He'd lost weight, and there were dark circles under his eyes like he wasn't sleeping. His wife, Sarah, had started asking me if I knew what was wrong with him. She said he'd been getting up in the middle of the night and standing at the bedroom window, staring out at the ridge for hours at a time. She'd wake up and find him there, perfectly still, not even blinking, like he was in some kind of trance. I tried to talk sense into him. I told him the old stories, reminded him what had happened to the people who'd followed that light before. But Hugo had made up his mind. He was going to find out what was really up on that ridge, and nothing I said was going to stop him. The night Hugo decided to follow the lantern was October 13th, 1992, 85 years to the day after Eliza Hardwick had been found dead at the bottom of that ravine. I know because Hugo called me that evening, his voice tight with excitement and something else I couldn't quite identify. Fear, maybe, or anticipation. He told me he'd been watching the ridge every night for 2 weeks, and the lantern had appeared exactly 7 times, always on the nights when the moon was dark. Tonight was going to be another new moon, and he was certain the light would appear again. He was going to follow it this time, no matter where it led. I begged him not to go. I reminded him of Sarah, of his 2 young daughters, of all the reasons he had to stay home and leave the past buried. But Hugo's mind was made up. He said he'd been having dreams about the lantern, dreams where he could hear voices calling to him from the mountain, telling him it was time to come home. That should have been my first warning. The voices. But I was too worried about Hugo to pay attention to the details. He asked me to come with him, said he didn't want to go alone, that maybe 2 of us together would be safer than 1. I should have said no. I should have gone to Sarah and told her what Hugo was planning. I should have called the sheriff, or the pastor, or anyone who might have been able to talk sense into him. Instead, I said yes. I met Hugo at the base of Widow's Ridge just before midnight. He was already there, waiting beside his truck with a flashlight in one hand and a thermos of coffee in the other. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, but there was an energy about him that I'd never seen before. His eyes were bright, almost feverish, and he kept glancing up at the ridgeline like he was expecting something to appear at any moment. We didn't talk much as we made our way up the mountain. The trail was steep and rocky, winding through dense stands of oak and maple that blocked out most of the starlight. Our flashlights carved narrow tunnels through the darkness, revealing patches of moss-covered stone and the occasional flash of eyes from some small animal disturbed by our passage. The higher we climbed, the more wrong everything felt. The forest was too quiet. No owls calling, no rustle of leaves from nocturnal creatures moving through the underbrush. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. The air grew thick and heavy, like it does before a thunderstorm, but the sky was clear and filled with stars. About halfway up the ridge, Hugo stopped so suddenly that I nearly walked into him. He was staring off into the trees, his flashlight beam dancing across the trunks like he was searching for something. When I asked him what was wrong, he just shook his head and kept walking, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his free hand had curled into a fist. We reached the ridgeline just after 1 in the morning. The view from up there was spectacular, even in the dark. You could see for miles in every direction, the rolling hills and valleys spread out below us like a rumpled blanket. The lights of Clay County twinkled in the distance, and somewhere far off, a train whistle echoed through the hollows. Hugo found a fallen log to sit on and motioned for me to join him. We turned off our flashlights and sat in the darkness, waiting. The silence was profound, the kind of deep quiet you only find in the mountains on a still night. I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel the pulse of blood in my temples. Then Hugo grabbed my arm. The light appeared without warning, flickering to life about 100 yards to our left. It looked exactly like an old oil lantern, casting a warm yellow glow that seemed to push back the darkness in a perfect circle. But there was something wrong with that light, something that made my skin crawl even from a distance. It was too steady, too bright, and it cast shadows that seemed to move independently of the flame. The lantern began to move, bobbing along the ridgeline like someone was carrying it. But I couldn't see anyone holding it. The light seemed to float through the trees on its own, weaving between the trunks with an odd, hypnotic rhythm. And as it moved, I started to hear something. A sound so faint I wasn't sure at first if I was imagining it. Voices, calling from somewhere far below, echoing up through the mountain itself. Men's voices, hoarse and desperate, pleading for help, pleading for someone to dig them out. Hugo was already on his feet, his eyes fixed on the lantern with an intensity that frightened me. He took a step toward the light, then another, and I realized he was going to follow it, whether I came with him or not. I wish I could say I tried to stop him. I wish I could say I tackled him to the ground and dragged him back down the mountain by force. But the truth is, I was curious too. That lantern was the most beautiful and terrible thing I'd ever seen, and despite every instinct screaming at me to run, I wanted to know where it would lead. We followed the light deeper into the woods, stumbling over roots and rocks, branches catching at our clothes like grasping fingers. The lantern stayed just ahead of us, always visible, but never quite within reach. It led us off the main ridge and down into a hollow I'd never seen before, a place where the trees grew so thick that our flashlights barely penetrated the gloom. The voices grew louder as we descended. I could make out individual words now, fragments of sentences that chilled me to the bone. They were calling for their wives, for their children, for anyone who might hear them. They were begging for water, for food, for just one breath of clean air. And underneath it all, threading through the desperate pleas, was a woman's voice, soft and sad, and infinitely lonely. She was calling for Thomas. The lantern led us to a clearing at the bottom of the hollow, a place where the earth was torn and scarred like something had been digging. In the center of the clearing was a hole, perfectly round and so deep that our flashlight beams couldn't find the bottom. The lantern hovered at the edge of that hole, casting its warm glow down into the darkness. That's when I saw her. Eliza Hardwick stood on the far side of the clearing, her lantern held high, her white hair flowing in a wind that didn't touch anything else. She was exactly as my great-grandfather had described her. Thin as a rail, her dress hanging off her frame like a burial shroud, her eyes black as coal and empty as the spaces between stars. But there was something else about her, something that made my blood run cold. She was smiling. It wasn't a human smile. It was the smile of something that had been waiting for a very long time, something that had finally found what it was looking for. She looked at Hugo with an expression of such profound hunger that I felt my knees go weak. Hugo was walking toward her. I tried to call out to him, tried to grab his arm, but I couldn't move. My body had gone rigid with terror, my muscles locked in place like I'd been turned to stone. I could only watch as my best friend walked toward that terrible woman, his eyes fixed on her face with an expression I'd never seen before. Love. Hugo looked at Eliza Hardwick with the same expression he'd worn on his wedding day, the same look he'd given his daughters when they were born. He was in love with her, or with what she represented. He was in love with the mystery, with the tragedy, with the romance of eternal devotion that had consumed her for nearly a century. When Hugo reached the edge of the hole, Eliza held out her lantern to him. He took it with both hands, cradling it like a precious child, and the moment his fingers touched the metal, I heard his voice join the chorus rising from the depths. Not his speaking voice, but something deeper, something that came from the very core of his being. He was calling for Sarah. The lantern in Eliza's hands flickered and went out. Her form began to fade, becoming translucent, then transparent, then gone entirely. But Hugo remained, standing at the edge of that terrible hole with the lantern clutched to his chest, his mouth open in a silent scream that I could hear in my bones. That's when I was finally able to move. I ran through those dark woods like a madman, crashing through branches and underbrush, falling over roots and rocks, my flashlight beam dancing wildly in front of me. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, and then I walked until I found the trail that led back down the mountain. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, and I didn't stop shaking until I was halfway home. I never told anyone what happened that night. What could I say? That my best friend had been claimed by a century-old ghost? That he'd taken the place of a woman who'd been dead for 85 years? Who would believe such a story? Hugo's body was found 3 days later at the bottom of a ravine on the far side of the mountain. The official cause of death was listed as accidental fall, probably due to disorientation in the dark. There was no mention of the clearing, no mention of the hole, no mention of the lantern that was found clutched in his hands. An old oil lantern, the kind his grandmother used to carry to the outhouse before they got electricity. Sarah buried him in the Clay County Cemetery, next to his parents and grandparents. The whole town came to the funeral. Hugo had been well-liked, well-respected, a man who'd lived his entire life in these mountains and never caused trouble for anyone. The pastor spoke about his devotion to his family, his love for the land, his tragic end on the mountain he'd known since childhood. But I know the truth. Hugo didn't fall off that ridge. He chose to stay there, chose to take up the burden that Eliza Hardwick had carried for almost a century. He's up there now, walking the ridge line with his lantern, searching for something he'll never find, calling for a woman who's sleeping safe and sound in a house he'll never see again. And sometimes, on the nights when the moon is dark and the wind is still, I can hear him calling, not his voice, but something deeper, something that comes from the mountain itself. He's calling for Sarah, just like Eliza called for Thomas, just like someone will call for the next person foolish enough to follow that light. You ever feel like something's watching you out in the woods? Like there's something just beyond the edge of your vision, something that's been waiting for you to notice it? That's how I feel every time I look up at Widow's Ridge. Like Hugo is up there, holding his lantern high, hoping I'll see it and come to keep him company. But I won't. I've learned my lesson. Some burdens are meant to be carried alone, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. The mountain has claimed Hugo, just like it claimed Eliza, just like it will claim the next person who's foolish enough to believe that love can conquer death. I'm writing this down so that someone will know what really happened, so that maybe someone else won't make the same mistake Hugo made. Don't go looking for that lantern. Don't follow that light. And if you ever find yourself on Widow's Ridge on a dark night, and you see a warm yellow glow moving through the trees, turn around and walk away. Because the mountain is always hungry, and it's always looking for someone new to feed it. The voices are calling again tonight. I can hear them through my bedroom window, echoing up from the hollow, pleading for help. And somewhere among them, carried on the wind like a prayer, is Hugo's voice, calling for Sarah. I think I'll close the curtains tonight. I think I'll try not to listen. But I know I will. That's where the journal entry ends. My grandfather never wrote about the lantern again, never mentioned Hugo or what happened on Widow's Ridge. But my grandmother told me that for the rest of his life, he refused to go anywhere near that part of the county. He'd drive 30 miles out of his way to avoid passing by the ridge, and he never hunted or fished in those mountains again. The thing is, I looked up the records. Hugo Brennan did die in October 1992, found at the bottom of a ravine on Widow's Ridge. The official cause of death was listed as accidental fall. There was no mention of a lantern in the police report, but there was something else. Something that made me understand why my grandfather never talked about this. Hugo's body was found on October 16, 1992. But according to the coroner's report, he'd been dead for at least a week, which means he died on October 13th, maybe even earlier. The same night my grandfather wrote about following him up the mountain. The same night my grandfather claimed to have seen Hugo take the lantern from Eliza Hardwick's hands. I've been thinking about driving down to Clay County, about taking a look at Widow's Ridge for myself. But every time I start to plan the trip, I remember the way my grandfather used to look out his bedroom window on dark nights, the way he'd stand there perfectly still, like he was listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. Maybe some stories are better left in the past. Maybe some mysteries are meant to stay buried. But I can't stop thinking about that lantern, about what it might look like flickering through the trees on a moonless night. I can't stop wondering if Hugo is really up there, walking the ridgeline with his light held high, searching for something he'll never find. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind is still and the house is quiet, I think I can hear him calling. Not his voice, but something deeper, something that comes from the mountain itself, something that sounds like my name. My name is Jax, and I'm sharing this story to preserve my uncle's memory. Uncle Hiram passed away 3 months ago at the age of 78, and before he died, he asked me to write down what he told me about his hunting trip in October 1993. He made me promise to share it with others, saying people needed to know what's still out there in the old mountains. I've typed up his account exactly as he told it to me, word for word, during our last conversation. This is Uncle Hiram's story, in his own words. People call me Hiram, though my given name is Hiram Theodore Whitlock. I'm 78 years old as I tell this, and I've been hunting these Blue Ridge Mountains for over 60 years. Started when I was 12 with my daddy's old Springfield rifle, and I've taken deer, bear, wild turkey, and everything else that moves through these hills. I know every ridge, every hollow, every game trail from Grandfather Mountain down to Mount Mitchell. I mention this because what I'm about to tell you happened to a man who knows the difference between a spooked deer and something that ain't natural. It was October 1993, and I was 58 then, still strong enough to pack into the backcountry alone. I'd been planning this trip for months, wanting to get deep into the wilderness area where the big bucks hide during hunting season. Most folks stick to the accessible areas, but I knew of a spot about 8 miles back from the nearest logging road, a place I'd scouted in the summer. There was a saddle between 2 ridges where several deer trails converged, and I'd seen some impressive rubs and scrapes there. The weather had been perfect that October, with the leaves turning their brilliant reds and golds, and the nights getting cold enough to get the deer moving. I loaded my pack with enough supplies for 5 days, brought my favorite rifle, a Winchester Model 70 and 30-06, and headed out on a Tuesday morning when the forecast called for clear skies. The hike-in took me most of the day. The trail started at about 3,000 feet elevation and climbed steadily through mixed hardwood forest. I stopped frequently to check for sign, noting the fresh scrapes and rubs that told me the bucks were active. By late afternoon, I'd reached the saddle I was looking for, a relatively flat area about 50 yards wide nestled between 2 steep ridges. A small spring bubbled up from the rocks on the eastern side, providing water for the game that passed through. I set up my camp in a grove of white oaks about 30 yards from the spring. The trees provided some wind protection, and the location gave me a clear view of the main game trail that ran north to south through the saddle. I pitched my tent, a simple two-man dome that I'd used for years, and gathered enough firewood to last through the evening. As darkness fell, I cooked a simple meal of canned beans and crackers, banking the fire for the night. The first night passed without incident. I heard the usual sounds of the mountain at night: owls calling, the distant yip of coyotes, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I woke before dawn and spent the day hunting, moving carefully through the timber and glassing the open areas. I saw several does and a small buck, but nothing worth taking. The woods felt normal, alive with the sounds of squirrels and birds. The second night was when things began to change. I'd turned in around 9 o'clock, settling into my sleeping bag with the contentment that comes from a good day in the mountains. The temperature had dropped into the low 30s, and I could hear the wind picking up in the trees above. I was drifting off to sleep when I heard something that made me pause. It was a sound like a large animal moving through the woods, but there was something off about it. Deer are usually quiet when they move, placing their hooves carefully to avoid making noise. Bears lumber along, breaking sticks and rustling leaves. This was different. It sounded like something large walking deliberately, with a measured pace that seemed almost human. I lay still in my sleeping bag, listening. The sound circled my camp, staying just at the edge of the firelight. I could track its movement by the soft crunch of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig. Whatever it was being careful, but not careful enough to move silently. The circling continued for what felt like an hour. I reached for my rifle, which I kept loaded and ready beside my sleeping bag. The sound would move from the north side of my camp to the east, then south, then west, always maintaining the same distance from my tent. I began to feel uneasy in a way I'd never experienced in all my years of hunting alone. Then it stopped. I waited in the darkness, straining to hear any sound that might tell me where the animal had gone. The normal night sounds of the forest had gone quiet, as if every creature was holding its breath. Even the wind seemed to have died down. I lay there for another hour, rifle ready, before exhaustion finally took me and I fell asleep. When I woke at dawn, I found the first signs that something was very wrong. There were tracks around my tent. I've tracked animals my entire life, and I know the print of every creature that lives in these mountains. These tracks were unlike anything I'd ever seen. They were roughly the size and shape of a human footprint, but elongated, with what looked like claw marks at the toe end. The prints were deep, indicating something heavy, and they circled my tent in a perfect ring about 10 feet out from the walls. More disturbing were the marks I found near the spring. Long gouges in the soft earth, as if something with claws had been dragging itself along the ground. The gouges were too long and too deep to have been made by any animal I knew. They started at the edge of the tree line and led to within a few feet of where I'd been sleeping. I spent the morning examining the tracks and trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The logical part of my mind told me it had to be a bear, maybe one with an injured paw that would account for the unusual print shape. But I'd seen bear tracks thousands of times, and these were different. They were too purposeful, too deliberate. I decided to stay another night. I'd come too far to give up after one strange encounter, and I convinced myself that whatever had visited my camp was probably just a curious animal that would move on once it realized I wasn't a threat. The third night was worse. I kept my fire burning later than usual, feeding it fresh wood until nearly midnight. I'd moved my rifle to within arm's reach and had my flashlight ready. As the night deepened, I heard it again, the same measured footsteps circling my camp. But this time, the sound was closer. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle and unzipped my tent flap. The beam of light swept across the trees, revealing nothing but shadows and the flickering shapes of leaves moving in the wind. But I could still hear it out there, just beyond the reach of my light. The footsteps had stopped, but I could sense something watching me from the darkness. I kept the light moving, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. Then I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a huffing noise, like a large animal breathing hard, but it had an almost human quality to it. The sound came from directly behind my tent. I spun around, pointing the flashlight toward the sound, but saw nothing. The huffing continued for several minutes, moving slowly from one side of my camp to the other. I stayed crouched in my tent opening, rifle ready, until the sound finally faded away. When morning came, I found more tracks, and this time they were even closer to my tent. Some of the prints were less than 5 feet from where I'd been sleeping. The claw marks were deeper and more numerous, as if whatever was making them had been agitated. I also found something else that chilled me to the bone. On the north side of my camp, I discovered a pile of bones. They were old, bleached white by weather and time, and they looked like they came from several different animals. Deer bones, what might have been bear bones, and others I couldn't identify. They'd been arranged in a rough circle, as if placed there deliberately. I'd hunted these mountains for decades and had never seen anything like this. Predators don't arrange their kills in patterns. They eat what they can and leave the rest where it falls. This was something else entirely. I should have left then. Every instinct I'd developed over 60 years of hunting was telling me to pack up and get out. But I was stubborn, and I was curious. I'd never encountered anything in these mountains that I couldn't explain, and I wasn't about to start running from shadows. I decided to set up my trail camera. I'd bought the camera the previous spring, one of the new digital models that could take pictures automatically when triggered by movement. I'd been using it to scout deer patterns on my property, and I'd brought it along on this trip thinking it might help me locate the big buck I was after. I mounted the camera on an oak tree about 20 feet from my tent, positioning it to cover the area where I'd seen the most tracks. The camera was motion activated and had an infrared flash that would allow it to take pictures in complete darkness. If something was visiting my camp at night, I'd finally have proof of what it was. The fourth night was the worst yet. I'd barely gotten into my sleeping bag when I heard it again. The footsteps were closer this time, and they seemed to be coming from multiple directions. I lay perfectly still, listening as whatever was out there moved around my camp with increasing boldness. The huffing sound started again, but now it was accompanied by other noises. Scratching sounds, as if something was testing the fabric of my tent with its claws. A low rumbling that might have been growling. And underneath it all, a sound that raised the hair on the back of my neck, something that sounded almost like whispering. I wanted to grab my rifle and confront whatever was out there, but some primitive part of my brain kept me frozen in place. I'd spent my life in these mountains, and I'd never been afraid of any animal that lived here. But this was different. This felt malevolent in a way that no wild animal ever had. The sounds continued for hours. Sometimes they would fade away, and I'd think whatever it was had finally left. Then they would start again, closer than before. I began to feel like I was being tested, as if something was trying to determine how much it could get away with before I reacted. Toward dawn, everything went silent again. I waited until full daylight before leaving my tent. The tracks were everywhere now, covering the ground around my camp like a dance floor. They led in all directions, disappearing into the forest and reappearing near my tent. But it was the marks on my tent itself that made me realize I was dealing with something far more dangerous than I'd imagined. Long parallel scratches ran along the side of my tent, starting about 4 feet off the ground and extending down nearly to the stakes. Whatever had made them had stood upright and reached down with claws or talons to scrape the fabric. The scratches were too high and too deliberate to have been made by any four-legged animal. I checked my trail camera, and the red light was blinking, indicating it had been triggered during the night. My hands shook as I removed the memory card and inserted it into the small viewer I'd brought along. What I saw on that camera changed everything I thought I knew about these mountains. The first few images showed nothing unusual, just the empty forest captured in the eerie black and white of infrared photography. Then, at 11:43 p.m., something entered the frame. At first I thought it was a deer. The shape was roughly the right size, and I could see what looked like antlers. But as I scrolled through the images, I realized what I was looking at was impossible. The creature was walking upright on 2 legs. It moved with a fluid, almost graceful gait that was definitely not human, but was far too coordinated to be any animal I knew. The antlers were massive, easily the largest I'd ever seen, but they were attached to a head that was wrong in every way. In the infrared images, I couldn't make out details, but the proportions were all off. The creature circled my tent repeatedly, sometimes stopping to examine it closely. In one image, it appeared to be reaching toward my tent with what looked like elongated arms. In another, it seemed to be looking directly at the camera, as if it knew it was being watched. But it was the final image that made me drop the viewer and step back from my camp. The creature was standing perhaps 10 feet from my tent, and it was no longer moving. It stood perfectly still facing my tent, and I could see that what I'd taken for a deer's head was actually something else entirely. It appeared to be wearing a skull, a deer skull, with the antlers still attached, and where the face should have been, there was nothing but darkness. I stared at the image for a long time, trying to process what I was seeing. This wasn't an animal. This was something else, something that had been watching me, studying me, playing some kind of game that I didn't understand. I packed up my camp in less than an hour. The hike out was a nightmare. Every sound in the forest made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hide something watching me. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the creature following me, but I saw nothing. The normal sounds of the woods had returned. Birds singing, squirrels chattering, the distant sound of a woodpecker working on a dead tree. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I made it back to my truck as the sun was setting, and I've never been so glad to hear the sound of an engine starting. The drive home took me through several small mountain towns, and I found myself looking at the people I passed, wondering if any of them had ever encountered what I'd seen in the woods. I've told this story to very few people over the years. Most folks would think I was crazy, or that I'd been drinking, or that I'd simply misidentified some common animal. But I know what I saw in those pictures, and I know what I experienced in that camp. I did some research after I got home, digging through old books and talking to some of the older folks who've lived in these mountains their whole lives. I learned that the Cherokee who lived in this area before they were forced out had stories about creatures that weren't quite animal and weren't quite human. They had different names for them, but the descriptions were remarkably similar to what I'd encountered. One old-timer I talked to, a man named Henry Sizemore, who was in his 90s then, told me his grandfather had spoken of something called the Deer Man. According to the stories, it was a creature that could take the form of a deer, but would sometimes walk upright like a man. It was said to be curious about humans, but also dangerous if provoked or threatened. Henry told me his grandfather had warned him to never hunt alone in certain areas of the mountains, places where the old spirits still walked. He said the Deer Man was drawn to solitary hunters, and that it would sometimes follow them for days, learning their habits and routines. I asked Henry if he'd ever seen anything like what I described, and he got a strange look in his eyes. He told me that some things were better left undisturbed, and that the smart thing to do was to stay away from places where such creatures might be found. I've never returned to that spot in the mountains. Over the years, I've had plenty of opportunities to go back. I've hunted in other areas of the same wilderness, some of them within a few miles of where I encountered the creature. But I've never felt the urge to return to that particular saddle between the ridges. Sometimes, late at night when the wind is howling through the trees, I think about what I saw in those trail camera images. I wonder if the creature is still out there, walking through the forest on two legs, wearing its gruesome mask of bone and antler. I wonder if it remembers me, and if it's still curious about the human who invaded its territory all those years ago. I've often thought about going back with a larger group, maybe bringing some other experienced hunters who might be able to help me understand what I encountered. But something stops me every time. Maybe it's wisdom, or maybe it's just fear. Some things are better left alone, and some questions are better left unanswered. But I still have those images. I printed them out and kept them in a box in my closet, along with sketches I made of the tracks I found around my camp. Sometimes I take them out and look at them, trying to convince myself that what I saw was just a trick of the light, or a malfunction of the camera, or anything other than what it appeared to be. It never works. The creature in those images is real, and it's unlike anything that's supposed to exist in these mountains. It's intelligent, it's purposeful, and it's still out there somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Blue Ridge. I've spent the last 30 years trying to forget what I saw, but the memory refuses to fade. It's as clear now as it was the morning I first saw those impossible tracks around my tent. Sometimes I dream about it, and in those dreams, I'm back in that tent, listening to the sound of something circling my camp. Something that walks like a man, but isn't human. In the dreams, I always wake up just as the creature reaches my tent. I'm 78 years old now, and I know I don't have many more years left. My hunting days are long behind me, and I spend most of my time sitting on my porch, watching the mountains I've loved my entire life. But I still think about that creature, and I still wonder if it's thinking about me. There are nights when the wind is particularly strong, when it howls through the trees with a sound that's almost like breathing, that I think I can hear something moving in the darkness beyond my porch light. On those nights, I find myself looking toward the mountains, wondering if something is looking back. I've never seen any evidence that the creature followed me home, but I can't shake the feeling that our encounter in 1993 wasn't the end of the story. Something that intelligent, something that curious, doesn't just forget about a human who stumbled into its territory. The Cherokee had a saying about certain places in the mountains, places where the old spirits still walked. They said that once you'd seen such a place, it would see you in return, and that connection would last until one of you was gone from this world. I think about that saying a lot these days. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed in that camp longer, tried to understand what the creature wanted. Maybe it was just curious. Maybe it meant no harm. But then I remember the scratches on my tent, the pile of bones arranged in a circle, and the absolute wrongness of seeing something that looked like a deer walking upright through the forest. No, I think I made the right choice in leaving. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some encounters are better left unfinished. But I still have those images, and I still remember every detail of those 4 nights in the mountains. And sometimes, when the wind is just right and the shadows are deep, I find myself wondering if the creature remembers me too. The Blue Ridge Mountains are vast, covering millions of acres of wilderness that few people ever see. There are places in those mountains where humans have never set foot, places where the old stories still have power, and somewhere in that wilderness, something walks upright through the forest, wearing the skull of a deer and watching for solitary travelers who venture too far from the beaten path. I've told this story to preserve the memory of what I saw, but also to warn others who might be tempted to venture into places where they don't belong. The mountains are beautiful, but they're also ancient, and they hold secrets that we're not meant to understand. If you ever find yourself alone in the deep woods, and you hear the sound of something large moving through the trees with a measured, deliberate pace, trust your instincts. If you see tracks that don't match any animal you know, or if you find bones arranged in patterns that nature doesn't create, don't stay to investigate. Pack up your gear and leave. Some things are better left undisturbed, and some encounters are better avoided altogether. The mountains will always be there, but some of the things that live in them are older than our understanding, and they don't follow the rules we think we know. I learned that lesson 30 years ago, and I've never forgotten it. The creature I encountered in that saddle between the ridges was real, and it was intelligent, and it was something that shouldn't exist according to everything I thought I knew about the natural world. But it does exist, and it's still out there, walking through the forest on 2 legs, wearing its mask of bone and antler, and watching for the next solitary traveler who ventures too far into its domain. And sometimes, on nights when the wind howls through the trees and the shadows are deep, I think it's still watching for me. Uncle Hiram passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 months after telling me this story. He was found in his bed with a peaceful expression on his face, and the coroner said it looked like his heart had simply stopped. But there was something strange about his death that I've never mentioned to anyone until now. The morning he died, I went to his house to check on him, as I did every few days. I found him in his bed, but I also found something else that made no sense. There were muddy footprints on his bedroom floor, tracks that looked like they'd been made by something with claws. They led from his bedroom window to his bed and back again. The window was open, even though it had been a cold night, and the screen had been torn open from the outside. The police said it was probably just a raccoon or possum that had gotten into the house, but I knew better. I'd seen similar tracks before, in Uncle Hiram's story and in the pictures he'd shown me. I never told anyone about the tracks, and I had them cleaned up before the funeral director arrived. But I kept thinking about what Uncle Hiram had said about the Cherokee belief that once you'd seen a place, it would see you in return. I think something had been watching him all these years, and I think it finally came to collect what it considered its due. Uncle Hiram had always said that some encounters are never really finished, and I think he was right. I'm sharing this story now because I think people need to know what's still out there in the old mountains. Uncle Hiram made me promise to tell it, and I'm keeping that promise. but I'm also telling it as a warning. Stay on the marked trails. Don't camp alone in the deep woods. And if you ever see something that walks like a man but isn't human, don't wait around to get a better look. Some things are better left undisturbed, and some secrets are better left buried in the deep places of the world. In the hollers and ridges of eastern Kentucky, where the mist clings to the mountainsides like the breath of sleeping giants, there exists a legend that has been whispered from generation to generation for over 2 centuries. It is the story of a cabin that appears only in October, manifesting along the old Cherokee Trail that winds through the heart of the Appalachian wilderness. The tale begins in the autumn of 1794, when the frontier was still wild and untamed, and the mountains held secrets that would never be fully understood by those who dared to venture into their depths. Samuel Hartwell, a settler from Virginia, had come to Kentucky with his wife Martha and their 3 children, seeking the promise of fertile land and a new beginning. They had built their homestead in a clearing beside Kettle Creek, where the soil was rich and the hunting was good. Samuel was a man of the mountains, born and raised in the shadow of the Blue Ridge. He knew the ways of the wilderness as well as any Cherokee scout, could read the signs of weather and the behavior of birds, and understood the language of the forest in ways that would seem mystical to those who had never lived so close to the earth. His wife Martha was equally hardy, a woman who could birth a calf, preserve meat for winter, and shoot a rifle with accuracy that would shame many men. Their homestead sat at the junction of 3 ancient trails: the great Indian warpath that ran north to south through the mountains, the warrior's path that connected the Cherokee territories to the hunting grounds of Kentucky, and a smaller, older trail that the Cherokee called the Spirit Path. This last trail was one that even the native people spoke of with reverence and caution, for it was said to be a road between worlds, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin. The Cherokee had warned Samuel about building so close to the Spirit Path. Old Chief Dragging Canoe, before his death in 1792, had spoken to Samuel during one of their rare peaceful encounters. The chief had pointed to the narrow trail that wound through the darkest part of the forest, and told him that it was a road for spirits, that certain times of year brought visitors who were not entirely of this world. Samuel had listened respectfully, as he always did when the Cherokee spoke of such matters. But like many frontier settlers, he had dismissed such warnings as superstition. The first sign that something was amiss came in late September of 1794. Samuel was out checking his trap lines when he noticed smoke rising from a part of the forest where no homestead should be. The smoke was thin and blue, the kind that comes from a well-tended fire, and it rose straight up in the still air like a prayer reaching toward heaven. Samuel followed the smoke to its source and found himself standing at the edge of a clearing he had never seen before, though he had walked these woods countless times. In the center of the clearing stood a cabin, small and neat, built in the style of the earliest frontier dwellings. It was constructed of hewn logs, chinked with clay and moss, with a stone chimney that was perfectly proportioned to the structure. The cabin had a single door, flanked by 2 small windows with oiled paper instead of glass. A split rail fence surrounded a small garden where late vegetables still grew despite the approaching frost. What struck Samuel most forcefully was not the cabin itself, but the feeling of wrongness that settled over him as he gazed upon it. The clearing was too perfect, too neat, as if it had been carved from the wilderness by careful hands and maintained with meticulous attention. The cabin looked new, yet it also seemed to belong to the forest in a way that his own homestead, built only 2 years earlier, never had. Samuel called out a greeting, as was the custom among frontier folk, but received no answer. He waited, listening for any sound of habitation, but heard only the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant call of a hawk. The smoke continued to rise from the chimney, and Samuel could smell the pleasant aroma of cooking food, something like venison stew with wild onions and herbs. After several minutes of waiting, Samuel approached the cabin. The door was made of split planks, held together with wooden pegs and fitted with a simple latch. He knocked, the sound echoing strangely in the quiet clearing, but still received no response. When he tried the latch, he found it secure. The windows were too high for him to peer through easily, and the oiled paper made it impossible to see inside with any clarity. Samuel walked around the cabin, examining it carefully. The construction was excellent, showing the work of someone who truly understood the craft of building. The logs were perfectly fitted, the chinking was tight and even, and the roof was made of split shingles that overlapped with mathematical precision. Behind the cabin, he found a small shed that contained firewood, all cut to identical lengths and stacked with military precision. The garden was perhaps the most puzzling aspect of the entire scene. Late September in the Kentucky mountains was past the time for most vegetables, yet here were rows of beans, squash, and corn that looked as if they had been planted only weeks before. The soil was rich and dark, free of weeds, and the vegetables were at various stages of growth, as if they had been planted in succession to ensure a continuous harvest. Samuel spent nearly an hour exploring the clearing, but found no sign of whoever had built this remarkable homestead. The smoke continued to rise from the chimney, and the smell of cooking food grew stronger as the day wore on. Finally, as the sun began to set, Samuel returned home, his mind churning with questions and a growing sense of unease. Martha listened to his account with the careful attention she gave to all of Samuel's reports from his wanderings in the forest. She was a practical woman, not given to flights of fancy, but she had lived on the frontier long enough to know that the mountains held mysteries that defied easy explanation. When Samuel finished his story, she was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire that crackled in their own hearth. Finally, she spoke in the measured tones she used when discussing serious matters. She reminded Samuel of the Cherokee warnings about the spirit path, of the stories told by other settlers about strange encounters in the deep woods, and of the old legends that spoke of places where the natural order of things was suspended or altered. She suggested that Samuel stay away from the mysterious cabin, at least until they could better understand what they were dealing with. Samuel agreed, though reluctantly. His curiosity was aroused, and he found himself thinking about the cabin constantly over the next few days. He went about his normal routine of hunting, trapping, and preparing for winter, but his mind kept returning to the neat little clearing and the smoke rising from the chimney of a cabin that shouldn't exist. 3 days later, Samuel returned to the spot where he had found the cabin. The clearing was gone. In its place was thick forest, with no sign that it had ever been disturbed by human hands. The trees were old and massive, their trunks scarred by decades of weather and growth. The underbrush was thick and tangled, showing no evidence of recent cutting or clearing. Samuel searched the area carefully, thinking perhaps he had become confused about the location, but he found nothing. The experience left Samuel deeply shaken. He was a man who prided himself on his knowledge of the forest, his ability to navigate by landmarks and natural signs. The idea that he could have become so completely lost and confused was almost more disturbing than the mysterious appearance and disappearance of the cabin itself. October arrived with its usual pageantry of color and crisp air. The mountains burst into flame with the reds and golds of autumn, and the forest floor became a carpet of fallen leaves that rustled with every step. Samuel had almost convinced himself that the cabin had been some kind of hallucination, perhaps brought on by fatigue or the strange light that sometimes filtered through the forest canopy. Then, on the 3rd day of October, he found it again. This time, Samuel was hunting deer along the ridge above Kettle Creek when he caught sight of the smoke once more. His heart began to race as he made his way through the forest, following the thin blue column that rose above the trees. The clearing was exactly as he had found it before, down to the last detail. The cabin sat in its center like a jewel in a perfect setting, smoke rising from its chimney, the smell of cooking food drifting on the autumn air. Samuel approached more boldly this time, his rifle ready but not raised in a threatening manner. He called out another greeting, and this time he thought he heard a response from within the cabin, a sound like footsteps on a wooden floor, the creak of a door opening. But when he looked at the door, it remained closed, and no one appeared at the windows. The smell of food was stronger now, and Samuel could identify the components more clearly. There was venison, certainly, but also the aroma of fresh bread, wild greens, and something sweet that reminded him of the honey cakes his mother had made when he was a boy in Virginia. His stomach rumbled, reminding him that he had not eaten since dawn. Samuel knocked on the door again, more insistently this time. The sound echoed through the clearing, and he could swear he heard an answering knock from within the cabin. He tried the latch and found it unlocked. The door swung open easily, revealing the interior of the cabin in the golden light of late afternoon. The inside of the cabin was as perfect as the outside. The single room contained everything necessary for comfortable living in the wilderness. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a cheerful fire burning in the grate. A wooden table sat in the center of the room, set for a meal with wooden bowls and pewter spoons. A bed with a colorful quilt occupied one corner, while shelves along the walls held cooking utensils, candles, and various household items. On the table sat a feast that would have been impressive in any frontier household. There was a pot of venison stew, still steaming from the fire, fresh bread that looked as if it had just been removed from the oven, a bowl of wild greens dressed with some kind of oil, and a plate of honey cakes that filled the cabin with their sweet aroma. Everything was perfectly prepared and ready to eat, as if the cook had just stepped out for a moment. Samuel stood in the doorway, uncertain whether to enter. The cabin felt inhabited, as if someone had just been there and might return at any moment. The fire crackled warmly and the food smelled delicious, but there was something about the scene that made Samuel's skin crawl. It was too perfect, too ready, as if it had been prepared specifically for his arrival. After several minutes of hesitation, Samuel stepped across the threshold. The floor was made of split planks, smoothed and fitted with the same precision that characterized the rest of the cabin. His footsteps echoed in the small space, and he could hear the whisper of wind through the chinking between the logs. The fire popped and hissed, sending sparks up the chimney. Samuel examined the cabin carefully, looking for any clue about its inhabitants. The bed was neatly made, the quilt pulled tight and smooth. The shelves were orderly, with everything in its proper place. On one shelf he found a small collection of books, a Bible, an almanac, and a journal bound in leather. The journal was filled with entries written in a neat feminine hand, but the writing was in a language Samuel didn't recognize. The cooking implements were well made and well maintained. The pot hanging over the fire was iron, black with age and use. The wooden bowls on the table were carved from a single piece of wood, polished smooth by countless meals. The pewter spoons bore the marks of a craftsman's hammer, and the bread knife had a bone handle worn smooth by years of use. Samuel sat down at the table, his hunger overcoming his caution. The stew was delicious, rich with meat and vegetables that had been seasoned with wild herbs. The bread was fresh and warm, with a crust that cracked when he broke it. The greens were bitter but pleasant, dressed with what tasted like bear fat and wild onions. The honey cakes were sweet and light, flavored with nuts and berries. As he ate, Samuel found himself relaxing. The cabin was warm and comfortable, and the food was the best he had tasted in months. Outside, the wind was picking up, and he could hear the rustle of leaves and the creak of tree branches. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the overall atmosphere was one of peace and contentment. When he had finished eating, Samuel sat back in his chair and looked around the cabin once more. Now that his hunger was satisfied, he could appreciate the craftsmanship that had gone into its construction. Every detail was perfect, from the carefully fitted logs to the smooth plank floor. The furniture was simple but well made, and everything had its place. As the sun began to set, Samuel realized he should return home. Martha would be worried if he didn't return before dark, and he had no desire to navigate the forest trails in the darkness. He stood to leave, but as he reached the door, he heard something that made him freeze. From somewhere in the cabin came the sound of a woman humming. It was a melody Samuel didn't recognize, but it was hauntingly beautiful, with a lilting quality that seemed to echo in his bones. He turned around, expecting to see someone, but the cabin was empty. The humming continued, seeming to come from the walls themselves. Samuel felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard stories of haunted places, of spirits that lingered in locations where they had known happiness or suffered tragedy. The humming was not threatening, but it was definitely not natural. It continued for several minutes, rising and falling in a pattern that seemed almost like a conversation. When the humming finally stopped, Samuel wasted no time in leaving the cabin. He closed the door behind him and walked quickly across the clearing, not looking back until he reached the edge of the forest. When he did turn around, the cabin was still there, smoke rising from its chimney, looking as solid and real as his own homestead. Samuel made his way home through the gathering darkness, his mind racing with questions. Who had built the cabin? Where were its inhabitants? Why did it appear only in October? And most disturbing of all, why did it feel as if it had been prepared specifically for him? Martha listened to his account with growing concern. She had known Samuel for 15 years, and she had never seen him so shaken by anything. He was a man who faced bears and hostile Indians with calm determination, but this mysterious cabin had rattled him in a way that nothing else ever had. Over the next several days, Samuel found himself drawn back to the cabin repeatedly. Each time, it was exactly as he had left it, with fresh food on the table and a warm fire in the grate. The humming woman never appeared, but Samuel often heard her voice, sometimes humming, sometimes singing in that unknown language. The sound was always beautiful, always haunting, and always seemed to be welcoming him home. Samuel began to spend entire days at the cabin, eating the food that was always perfectly prepared, sitting by the fire, and listening to the mysterious woman's voice. He explored the surrounding forest but never found any other signs of habitation. The cabin existed in perfect isolation, an island of domestic comfort in the wild mountains. As October progressed, Samuel's visits to the cabin became more frequent and longer. Martha grew increasingly worried about his behavior. He was neglecting his normal duties, spending less time hunting and trapping, and showing little interest in preparing for winter. When she questioned him about the cabin, he would become evasive and defensive, insisting that she wouldn't understand. The crisis came on October 20th when Samuel failed to return home at all. Martha waited through the night, pacing the floor and listening for the sound of his footsteps. When dawn broke without any sign of him, she knew she had to act. Martha had never been to the mysterious cabin, but Samuel had described its location well enough that she thought she could find it. She armed herself with Samuel's spare rifle and set out into the forest, following the trails he had described. The October air was crisp and clear, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and small animals preparing for winter. It took Martha most of the morning to find the clearing, but when she did, she understood immediately why Samuel had been so fascinated by the place. The cabin was exactly as he had described it, perfect in every detail, with smoke rising from its chimney and the smell of cooking food drifting on the air. Martha approached the cabin cautiously, her rifle ready. She had not lived on the frontier for 15 years without learning to be careful in unfamiliar situations. She called out Samuel's name, and to her relief she heard his voice respond from within the cabin. When she opened the door, she found Samuel sitting at the table, eating from a bowl of stew. He looked up at her with a strange expression, part guilt, part defiance, and part something else that she couldn't quite identify. He seemed different somehow, as if he had been changed by his time in the cabin. Martha tried to convince Samuel to come home with her, but he refused. He insisted that he was perfectly safe, that the cabin was the most peaceful place he had ever known, and that he wasn't ready to leave. When Martha pressed him, he became agitated and told her that she couldn't understand, that the cabin was special, that it was meant for him. The argument that followed was the first serious disagreement of their marriage. Samuel refused to leave, and Martha refused to abandon him. Finally, as darkness began to fall, Martha agreed to spend the night in the cabin, hoping that by morning Samuel would see reason. The cabin was certainly comfortable, Martha had to admit. The bed was soft and warm, the fire provided cheerful light and heat, and the food was delicious. But there was something about the place that made her deeply uneasy. It was too perfect, too ready, as if it existed solely to lure people into its embrace. During the night, Martha heard the humming that Samuel had described. It was indeed beautiful, but to her ears it sounded less like a welcome and more like a lament. The melody seemed to speak of loss and longing, of someone who had been separated from everything they loved. Martha lay awake for hours, listening to the sad song and wondering about the woman who sang it. In the morning, Martha made one final attempt to convince Samuel to leave. She spoke of their children, of the approaching winter, of the work that needed to be done before the snows came. But Samuel seemed to have lost all interest in his former life. He spoke dreamily of staying in the cabin forever, of the peace and contentment he had found there. Realizing that she could not force Samuel to leave, Martha returned home to care for their children and prepare for winter alone. She continued to visit the cabin every few days, bringing news from the outside world and pleading with Samuel to return. But each time he seemed more distant. more entranced by the mysterious place. Other settlers began to notice Samuel's absence. The frontier community was small and close-knit, and everyone knew everyone else's business. When word spread that Samuel Hartwell was living in a mysterious cabin that appeared only in October, the story quickly became the subject of much discussion and speculation. Some of the older settlers remembered similar stories from their own past. There were tales of cabins that appeared in the deep woods, of mysterious voices that called to travelers, of places where the normal rules of the world seemed suspended. The Cherokee had many such stories, and some of the white settlers had begun to give credence to these accounts. A group of men decided to investigate the cabin for themselves. Led by Thomas Mackenzie, a respected hunter and Indian fighter, they made their way into the forest following Martha's directions. They found the clearing easily enough, and they saw the cabin exactly as it had been described. But when they approached the door, they found it locked, and no amount of knocking or calling could raise a response from within. The men could see smoke rising from the chimney, and they could smell cooking food, but the cabin might as well have been empty for all the response they got. They walked around the building, examining it carefully, but found no other way in. The windows were too high to reach, and the door was the only entrance. Frustrated, Thomas Mackenzie decided to force the door. He and two other men put their shoulders to it, and after several attempts, they managed to break it open. But when they rushed inside, they found the cabin empty. There was no sign of Samuel, no indication that anyone had been there recently. The fire was cold, the table was bare, and the bed was neatly made. Confused and more than a little frightened, the men searched the cabin thoroughly. They found nothing that would explain Samuel's disappearance or the mysterious nature of the place. The cabin was exactly what it appeared to be, a well-built frontier dwelling with all the normal furnishings and equipment. When the men returned to tell Martha what they had found, she was devastated. She had lost her husband to something she couldn't understand or fight. The community rallied around her, helping with the harvest and preparing her homestead for winter. But there was little they could do to ease her grief. As October drew to a close, Martha made one final visit to the cabin. She found it exactly as the men had described, empty, cold, and showing no signs of recent habitation. She called Samuel's name, but received no answer. She searched the surrounding forest, but found no trace of him. On November 1st, Martha returned to the clearing and found it empty. The cabin was gone, as if it had never existed. In its place was thick forest, with no sign that the land had ever been cleared or disturbed. Martha searched the area desperately but found nothing. The cabin had vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. Martha spent the winter as a widow, caring for her children and maintaining the homestead with the help of neighbors. She never spoke publicly about what had happened to Samuel, but the story spread throughout the frontier community. Some people believed that Samuel had simply run off, unable to handle the pressures of frontier life. Others thought he had been killed by Indians or wild animals, and that the mysterious cabin was just a product of grief and imagination. But Martha knew better. She had seen the cabin with her own eyes, had heard the haunting melody that drifted through its walls. She knew that Samuel had been taken by something beyond human understanding, something that existed in the spaces between the normal world and whatever lay beyond. The following October, Martha returned to the forest, hoping against hope that she might find some trace of her husband. She searched the areas where the cabin had appeared but found nothing. The forest was beautiful in its autumn colors, but it held no mysteries, no clearings that shouldn't exist, no cabins that appeared from nowhere. Martha never saw the cabin again, but she never stopped believing in its existence. She lived out her days on the frontier, raising her children and maintaining the homestead that she and Samuel had built together. She never remarried, and she never moved away from the area where the cabin had appeared. She said she was waiting for Samuel to return, though she never explained what she meant by that. The story of Samuel Hartwell and the mysterious cabin became part of the folklore of the region. Over the years, other people reported similar encounters, always in October, always along the old trails that wound through the deepest parts of the forest, and always involving a cabin that appeared and disappeared without explanation. In 1823, a trapper named Joseph Miller reported finding a cabin in the forest near the headwaters of the Cumberland River. The cabin was exactly as Samuel's had been described, small, neat, with smoke rising from the chimney and the smell of cooking food. Miller approached the cabin and found the door unlocked. Inside, he discovered a feast laid out on the table, but no sign of inhabitants. Miller ate the food, which was delicious, and spent the night in the cabin. During the night, he heard the humming that others had described, a woman's voice singing in an unknown language. The melody was beautiful, but mournful, and it seemed to speak of loss and longing. In the morning, Miller tried to leave the cabin, but found that he couldn't. Every time he reached the edge of the clearing, he would find himself back at the cabin door, as if the forest itself were conspiring to keep him there. He spent 3 days in this loop, growing increasingly desperate, before he finally managed to break free by following a stream that ran through the clearing. Miller's story added new details to the legend. It suggested that the cabin was not just a place of mysterious appearance, but a trap of some kind, designed to lure people in and keep them there. The humming woman, rather than being a benign presence, might be something more sinister, a spirit that collected souls, or a witch who fed on the life force of travelers. Other stories followed over the years. In 1847, a family named Peterson reported finding the cabin while traveling through the mountains. They spent a night there and heard the humming, but they managed to leave without incident. However, their youngest child, a girl of 7, claimed that she had seen a woman in the cabin, a sad-faced woman in a white dress who had beckoned to her from the shadows. In 1865, just after the Civil War, a group of Union soldiers searching for Confederate deserters reported finding the cabin. They broke down the door and searched it thoroughly, but found nothing. However, one of the soldiers, a man named Patrick O'Brien, claimed that he had seen a woman watching them from the forest. She had been dressed in white, he said, and her face had been filled with such sadness that it had nearly brought him to tears. The stories continued through the latter half of the 19th century and into the 20th. Each account was slightly different, but certain elements remained constant. The cabin always appeared in October, always along the old trails, and always with smoke rising from its chimney and the smell of cooking food. The humming woman was almost always present, though she was rarely seen, and those who entered the cabin often found it difficult to leave, as if something within it was determined to keep them there. In 1923, a folklorist named Dr. Margaret Whitman from the University of Kentucky began collecting stories about the cabin. She interviewed dozens of people who claimed to have encountered it, and she found remarkable consistency in their accounts. The cabin was always described in the same way, down to the smallest details. The humming woman was always present, singing her mournful songs, and the cabin always disappeared at the end of October, leaving no trace of its existence. Dr. Whitman became convinced that the stories were based on real encounters with something genuinely mysterious. She spent several Octobers searching the forests of eastern Kentucky, but she never found the cabin herself. However, she did discover something interesting in her research into the history of the region. According to Cherokee oral tradition, the area where the cabin appeared had been the site of a tragic event in the years before European settlement. A Cherokee woman named Ayunini had lived there with her husband and children. During a harsh winter, her family had died of disease, leaving her alone in the wilderness. She had continued to live in their cabin, maintaining it as if her family were still alive, cooking meals for them and singing to them in the evenings. When spring came, other Cherokee found Ayunini's cabin empty. She had vanished, but the cabin remained, perfectly maintained and with fresh food on the table. The Cherokee believed that Ayunini had died of grief, but that her spirit remained in the cabin, continuing to care for her family in death as she had in life. The Cherokee considered the area to be sacred, but also dangerous. They believed that Ayunini's spirit was so powerful in her grief that she could draw other spirits to her, creating a place where the boundary between life and death was thin. They avoided the area, especially during the autumn months when the spirit world was said to be closest to the physical world. Dr. Whitman's research suggested that the cabin encountered by Samuel Hartwell and others might be the same cabin that Ayunini had inhabited centuries earlier. The spirit of the grieving woman, unable to accept the loss of her family, continued to maintain her home, cooking meals and singing lullabies to children who would never return. But why did the cabin appear only in October, and why did it seem to trap those who entered it? Dr. Whitman theorized that Ayunini's spirit was trying to replace the family she had lost. The cabin appeared during the time of year when the Cherokee believed the spirit world was closest to the physical world, allowing Ayunini to manifest her home in the realm of the living. She would lure travelers into the cabin with the promise of food and shelter, hoping to convince them to stay and become the family she had lost. The theory explained many of the consistent elements in the stories. The cabin was always perfectly maintained because Ayunini was still caring for it. The food was always ready because she was still cooking for her family. The humming was the lullabies she sang to her children, and the difficulty that people had in leaving the cabin was Ayunini's desperate attempt to keep them there, to make them stay and fill the void in her heart. Dr. Whitman's research was published in the Journal of American Folklore in 1924, and it brought national attention to the legend of the October Cabin. Reporters and investigators came to Kentucky to search for the mysterious structure, but none of them ever found it. The cabin, it seemed, revealed itself only to those who stumbled upon it by accident, not to those who sought it out. The Great Depression brought new stories of the cabin. Desperate people traveling the roads and trails in search of work sometimes reported finding the mysterious structure. To them, it was a godsend, a place of warmth and food when they had neither. But those who stayed too long found it difficult to leave, and some were never seen again. In 1934, a hobo named William Red Sullivan wrote about the cabin in a letter to his sister. He described finding it during a cold October night when he was nearly frozen and starving. The cabin had appeared like a miracle, with a warm fire and hot food waiting. He had stayed for 3 days, he said, listening to the beautiful singing that came from the walls. But when he tried to leave, he found himself walking in circles, always ending up back at the cabin door. Sullivan claimed that he had finally escaped by following a strategy he had learned from other hobos. He had walked backward out of the clearing, never taking his eyes off the cabin. This had broken whatever spell was keeping him there, and he had been able to find his way back to the railroad tracks. But he said that part of him had wanted to stay, that the cabin had felt more like home than any place he had ever been. World War II brought a temporary lull in the stories, as people had more pressing concerns than mysterious cabins in the forest. But in the 1950s, as Americans began to have more leisure time and disposable income, interest in the legend revived. Hunting and camping became popular pastimes, and people began to venture into the deep woods in greater numbers. This led to a new wave of cabin sightings. In 1956, a group of deer hunters from Ohio reported finding the cabin on a hunting trip to Kentucky. They described it exactly as previous witnesses had: small, neat, with smoke rising from the chimney and the smell of cooking food. One of the hunters, a man named Robert Chen, entered the cabin and found it furnished exactly as others had described. Chen stayed in the cabin for the night, eating the food and listening to the humming that seemed to come from the walls themselves. In the morning, he tried to convince his companions to see the cabin, but when they approached the clearing, they found it empty. Chen insisted that the cabin was there, that they just couldn't see it, but his friends thought he was either lying or suffering from some kind of delusion. The incident caused a rift in the group, and Chen never hunted with them again. He became obsessed with the cabin, returning to Kentucky every October to search for it. He claimed to have found it several more times over the years, but he could never bring anyone else to see it. His family and friends began to worry about his mental health, and his wife eventually left him, taking their children. Chen's story became part of the legend, adding a new element: the idea that the cabin might be selective about who could see it. Perhaps it only appeared to those who were in some way vulnerable or in need of what it offered. This would explain why it was often found by travelers who were lost, hungry, or desperate. In the 1960s, as the counterculture movement embraced mysticism and the supernatural, the cabin legend found a new audience. Young people, drawn to the idea of mysterious places and spiritual experiences, began to search for the cabin deliberately. They organized camping trips to the mountains of Kentucky, hoping to encounter the mysterious structure. Most of these seekers never found the cabin, but a few reported success. In 1967, a group of college students from the University of California at Berkeley claimed to have found the cabin during a camping trip. They described it as a place of incredible peace and beauty, where they had experienced visions and spiritual insights. One member of the group, a young woman named Linda Morrison, claimed to have seen Ayunini herself. a Cherokee woman in traditional dress singing and weeping in the forest. Morrison's account was different from earlier stories in several ways. She described Ayunini not as a malevolent spirit trying to trap people, but as a tragic figure who was simply unable to let go of her grief. The cabin, Morrison said, was a place where the pain of loss was so intense that it had created a kind of spiritual vortex, drawing people in and showing them their own deepest sorrows. This interpretation of the legend found favor with many people in the 1960s and 1970s, who saw it as a metaphor for the human condition. The cabin became a symbol of the way that grief and loss could trap people in the past, preventing them from moving forward with their lives. Ayunini's story was seen as a cautionary tale about the dangers of being unable to accept change and loss. The 1980s brought a new wave of interest in the cabin legend, fueled by the popularity of horror movies and supernatural fiction. The cabin was featured in several books and movies, usually as a malevolent force that trapped unwary travelers. These fictional accounts often strayed far from the original legend, turning Ayunini into a demonic figure and the cabin into a place of horror rather than sorrow. Real sightings of the cabin continued to be reported throughout this period. In 1985, a National Park Service ranger named David Kim reported finding the cabin while on patrol in the Daniel Boone National Forest. Kim was an experienced outdoorsman who had worked in the mountains for over 20 years, and he was not given to flights of fancy. Kim's account was notable for its matter-of-fact tone and careful attention to detail. He described finding the cabin exactly as others had, with smoke rising from the chimney and the smell of cooking food. He entered the cabin and found it furnished in the style of the early 19th century, with handmade furniture and primitive cooking implements. What struck Kim most forcefully was the sense of sadness that permeated the cabin. He described it as a feeling of overwhelming loss and longing, as if the very walls were saturated with grief. He heard the humming that others had described, but to his ears, it sounded like a mother singing to children who would never hear her again. Kim spent only a few minutes in the cabin before leaving, but he said that the experience had affected him profoundly. He began to research the history of the area, and he discovered the story of Ayunini and her family. He became convinced that the cabin was a genuine supernatural phenomenon, a place where the intensity of human emotion had somehow transcended the normal boundaries of space and time. The 1990s brought new technology to the search for the cabin. Ghost hunters and paranormal investigators began to use electromagnetic field detectors, infrared cameras, and other equipment to try to document the cabin. This story came to me from a man who spent his whole life in the mountains of eastern Tennessee, back when the coal was still king and the forest held secrets that modern folks have forgotten. He was pushing 80 when he told me this, sitting on his porch with a mason jar of something that burned going down, watching the mist roll up from the holler below. Said he'd carried this tale for near 30 years, waiting for the right person to tell it to. Said he reckoned I might understand, being from mountain people myself. I've been living in these hills for 73 years come October, and I seen things that would make a preacher question his faith. My granddaddy used to say the mountains remember everything, every drop of blood spilled, every soul lost, every promise broken. He wasn't wrong. The Appalachians are old, older than most folks can wrap their minds around, and they got a way of holding on to things that ought to be let go. This happened back in 1987, when Reagan was president, and the mines were already starting to close down around here. The young folks were heading off to Charlotte and Atlanta, looking for work in places that didn't smell like sulfur and coal dust. But some stayed, tied to these mountains by blood and stubbornness and something else they couldn't name. Tommy Whitfield was one of them that stayed. He was 22 that summer, fresh out of the Army and back home to his mama's house on Kettle Creek Road. Tommy was built like his daddy had been, tall and lean, with hands that knew how to work and eyes that saw more than most. He'd done a tour in Germany, came back speaking a little German and carrying stories about castles and forests that made our mountains seem tame by comparison. But Tommy learned quick enough that there ain't nothing tame about these hills, not if you know where to look. His sister Beth was 19 then. just finished with her first year at the community college down in Morristown. She was studying to be a nurse, but she spent her summers back home helping their mama tend the garden and preserve food for winter. Beth was the smart one in the family, always had been. She could read the weather by the way the leaves turned and knew which plants would heal and which ones would hurt. Their mama used to say Beth had the gift, though she never said what kind of gift that was. The Whitfield place sat at the end of a gravel road that wound up from the main highway like a snake looking for a warm rock. It was an old house, built by Tommy and Beth's great-grandfather back in 1923, when the logging company was still pulling timber out of these mountains. The house was solid, chestnut beams and fieldstone foundation, but it had that worn look that comes from too many winters and not enough money for paint. Their nearest neighbor was old Buck Morrison, who lived about a half-mile down the holler in a trailer he'd hauled up there in 1975. Buck was 68 and had worked the mines for 40 years before his lungs gave out. He knew every trail and every creek in a 20-mile radius, and he knew the stories that went with them. Buck had been friends with Tommy and Beth's daddy before the heart attack took him, and he'd kind of adopted the family after that, checking on them when the weather got bad and helping Tommy with the heavier work around the place. The trouble started in late July, when the heat was so thick you could cut it with a knife and the cicadas were screaming loud enough to wake the dead. Tommy had gotten work with a crew that was clearing brush for the power company, cutting back the laurel and rhododendron that grew up around the lines. It was hot, miserable work, but it paid decent, and Tommy needed the money if he was going to fix the roof before winter set in. The crew was working a section of line that ran up through what locals called the Ash Fork Hollow, a deep cut between two ridges where the sun barely touched the ground even at midday. It was dark country, thick with old-growth timber that the logging companies had somehow missed. The trees were massive, white oaks and tulip poplars that must have been standing when the Cherokee still hunted these mountains. The understory was so thick with mountain laurel and rhododendron that you couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction. Tommy told me later that the first thing he noticed was how quiet it was up there. Not the normal quiet of deep woods, but something else. Something that made the hair on his arm stand up and made him keep looking over his shoulder. The other men felt it too. He could tell by the way they worked faster than usual, not talking much, just wanting to get the job done and get out. It was on a Wednesday when they found the first one. Tommy was working maybe 50 yards from the main crew, cutting back a tangle of greenbrier that had grown up around a power pole, when he caught a glimpse of something white through the trees. He figured it was a piece of trash, maybe a plastic bag that had blown in from the road, but when he pushed through the brush to get a better look, he found something that made his blood run cold. It was a deer, a good-sized doe, hanging from a branch about 8 feet off the ground. But it wasn't hanging the way a hunter would hang a deer. This was different. The deer was suspended by its hind legs, and its belly had been opened clean and precise, like someone who knew exactly what they were doing had done the work. The strange part was that the deer was completely white, not just the pale tan of a regular deer, but white as snow, white as bone. Tommy had hunted these mountains since he was old enough to carry a rifle, and he'd never seen an albino deer. More than that, he'd never seen a deer butchered like this one. The cut was too clean, too careful. And there was something else. The deer's eyes were still open, and they were looking right at him. Not the glassy stare of a dead animal, but alert and aware, like it was still alive and watching. He called the other men over, and they stood there in a circle, staring up at the white deer and not saying much. Finally, the foreman, a man named Carson, who'd been working these mountains for 20 years, told them to leave it alone and get back to work. But Tommy could see that Carson was spooked too, the way he kept glancing back at the deer and wiping sweat from his face, even though it was cool under the trees. That evening, Tommy told Beth about what he'd found. They were sitting on the front porch after supper, watching the fireflies blink in the gathering dusk. Beth listened without interrupting, the way she always did, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said that their grandmother had told her stories about white deer, back when Beth was little. According to the old woman, white deer were messengers from the other side, creatures that appeared when the boundary between the living world and the dead world was wearing thin. She said the Cherokee believed that killing a white deer would bring a curse on the hunter and his family, but that finding one already dead was even worse. It meant something powerful and hungry had crossed over from the spirit world. Tommy laughed it off, said it was probably just some poacher who'd gotten lucky and found an albino deer. But Beth could see he was troubled by it, the way he kept staring off into the woods and jumping at every sound. The next day, Tommy went back to work in the hollow, but he made sure to stay close to the other men. The white deer was still there, still hanging from the same branch, but something had changed. The meat was gone, not eaten, but carved away with the same precise cuts that had opened the belly. What remained was a perfect skeleton, white bones gleaming in the filtered sunlight, still suspended by tendons and dried skin. Carson took one look at it and called the job off. Said they'd finish the line work somewhere else and come back to the hollow later, maybe in the fall when the leaves were down and they could see better. But Tommy knew they wouldn't be back. He could see it in Carson's eyes, the same look he'd seen on soldiers' faces in Germany when they talked about the old forests there, the places where the trees grew too thick and the shadows moved when they shouldn't. That weekend, Tommy decided to go back to the hollow on his own. He told Beth he wanted to get another look at the deer, maybe take some pictures to show the game warden. But the real reason was that he couldn't stop thinking about it. The image of those white bones hanging in the green shadows had worked its way into his mind like a splinter, and he knew he wouldn't have any peace until he understood what he'd seen. He asked Beth to come with him, and after some thought, she agreed. They packed a lunch and some water, and on Saturday morning they drove up the mountain road to where the power line crossed the highway. The access road was barely more than a dirt track, rutted from heavy trucks and grown over with weeds. Tommy's pickup bounced and scraped along the uneven ground, kicking up clouds of dust that hung in the still air. They parked at the end of the access road and walked up along the power line, following the cleared swath through the forest. The day was overcast with low clouds that seemed to catch in the treetops and turn the world gray and muffled. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of rotting leaves and stagnant water. When they reached the place where Tommy had found the deer, it was gone. Not just the meat, the whole thing, bones and all. The branch it had hung from was still there, but there was no sign that anything had ever been suspended from it. No marks on the bark, no staining on the ground below. Nothing. Tommy stood there staring at the empty branch, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He knew he hadn't imagined it. The other men had seen it too. But now there was nothing, as if the white deer had never existed at all. Beth walked around the area, studying the ground and the trees with the careful attention she'd learned from their grandmother. After a few minutes, she called Tommy over to look at something. She was kneeling beside a large oak tree, pointing at marks in the bark about 7 feet off the ground. They looked like scratches, but they were too deep and too regular to be from an animal. They formed a pattern, a series of lines and curves that almost looked like letters, but not from any alphabet Tommy recognized. Below the marks, the ground was torn up as if something large had been digging or scraping at the earth. The soil was dark and rich, but it had an odd smell, like copper pennies and old meat. Beth touched the disturbed earth with her fingertip, then quickly pulled her hand back. She stood up and wiped her finger on her jeans, but Tommy could see that her hand was shaking. They decided to explore a little further into the hollow, following a faint trail that led away from the power line and deeper into the forest. The trail was old, probably cut by deer or maybe by hunters years ago, and it wound between the massive trees like a thread through a maze. The deeper they went, the darker it became, even though it was still midday. The canopy was so thick that only scattered beams of sunlight reached the forest floor, creating a patchwork of light and shadow that played tricks on the eyes. After about 20 minutes of walking, they came to a small clearing where the trail forked. In the center of the clearing was a pile of stones, carefully arranged in a rough circle about 6 feet across. The stones were covered with moss and lichen, and they looked like they'd been there for a very long time. But what caught Tommy's attention was what was inside the circle. It was bones, lots of them, scattered across the ground like someone had dumped a bucket of them there. Most were small, birds and squirrels, maybe a few rabbits. But mixed in with the small bones were larger ones, the kind that might have come from deer. And at the center of the pile was something that made Tommy's stomach turn. It was a skull, bleached white and perfectly clean, but it was too big to be from any animal Tommy knew. It was almost human-sized, but the shape was wrong, elongated and twisted, with too many teeth. Beth backed away from the stone circle, her face pale. She grabbed Tommy's arm and pulled him toward the trail fork that led back the way they'd come. But as they turned to leave, they heard something that froze them in place. It was a sound like singing, but not quite. More like humming, a low, wordless melody that seemed to come from all directions at once. The sound was beautiful and terrible at the same time, like the voices of angels with their throats cut. It rose and fell in waves, sometimes loud enough to echo off the trees, sometimes so soft they could barely hear it. Tommy and Beth ran. They didn't talk about it, didn't plan it, they just ran. They crashed through the underbrush, following the trail back toward the power line, branches whipping at their faces and roots catching at their feet. The humming followed them, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but always there, like a dog following a scent. They didn't stop running until they reached the pickup truck, and even then Tommy had trouble getting the key in the ignition because his hands were shaking so badly. They drove back down the mountain in silence, neither of them wanting to talk about what they'd seen and heard. That night, Beth couldn't sleep. She lay in bed listening to the sounds of the forest outside her window, the usual chorus of crickets and tree frogs and night birds. But underneath the familiar sounds, she thought she could hear something else. That humming, so faint she might have been imagining it, drifting up from the hollow like mist. She got up and went to the window, pushing aside the curtains to look out at the dark line of trees that marked the edge of their property. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in silver light and deep shadow. At first, she saw nothing unusual. Then, at the edge of the tree line, she saw movement. It was white, pale as moonlight, moving between the trees with a fluid grace that didn't look quite natural. At first, she thought it might be a deer, but as she watched, she realized it was walking upright, like a person. It was tall, taller than any person she'd ever seen, and its arms were too long for its body. It moved through the trees without making a sound, gliding rather than walking, and it seemed to be heading toward the house. Beth wanted to call out to Tommy, to wake him up and tell him to come look, but she found she couldn't speak. The thing at the edge of the trees had stopped moving and was now standing perfectly still, looking directly at her window. Even from that distance, she could see its eyes, pale and luminous in the moonlight, fixed on her with an intelligence that was both ancient and alien. They stared at each other across the yard, the girl at the window and the white thing at the edge of the forest. Beth felt a strange calm settle over her, as if the fear had been drawn out of her body and replaced with something else. She understood, in that moment, that she was looking at something that had been waiting for her, something that had been calling to her family for generations. The thing raised one long arm and pointed at her, and Beth felt a pull in her chest, a tugging sensation like a fishhook in her heart. She knew, without knowing how she knew, that it wanted her to come outside, to walk across the yard and into the forest. The urge was almost overwhelming, like the strongest thirst she'd ever felt, but magnified 100-fold. She might have done it, might have walked right out of the house and into the waiting arms of whatever was calling to her, but at that moment Tommy's voice came from the hallway behind her, asking if she was all right. The sound of his voice broke the spell, and Beth stumbled backward from the window, gasping as if she'd been holding her breath. When she looked back at the tree line, the white thing was gone. The next morning, Beth told Tommy what she'd seen, and he listened with the same careful attention she'd shown him when he told her about the deer. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee cup, like he might find answers there. Finally, he said they needed to talk to Buck Morrison. Buck had lived in these mountains longer than anyone, and if there was something strange happening in the hollow, he'd know about it. They drove down to Buck's trailer and found him sitting in his usual spot on the front steps, smoking a cigarette and watching the clouds build up over the ridge. She got up and went to the window, pushing aside the curtains to look out at the dark line of trees that marked the edge of their property. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in silver light and deep shadow. At first, she saw nothing unusual. Then, at the edge of the tree line, she saw movement. It was white, pale as moonlight, moving between the trees with a fluid grace that didn't look quite natural. At first, she thought it might be a deer, but as she watched, She realized it was walking upright, like a person. It was tall, taller than any person she'd ever seen, and its arms were too long for its body. It moved through the trees without making a sound, gliding rather than walking, and it seemed to be heading toward the house. Beth wanted to call out to Tommy, to wake him up and tell him to come look, but she found she couldn't speak. The thing at the edge of the trees had stopped moving and was now standing perfectly still, looking directly at her window. Even from that distance, she could see its eyes, pale and luminous in the moonlight, fixed on her with an intelligence that was both ancient and alien. They stared at each other across the yard, the girl at the window and the white thing at the edge of the forest. Beth felt a strange calm settle over her, as if the fear had been drawn out of her body and replaced with something else. She understood, in that moment, that she was looking at something that had been waiting for her, something that had been calling to her family for generations. The thing raised one long arm and pointed at her, and Beth felt a pull in her chest, a tugging sensation like a fishhook in her heart. She knew, without knowing how she knew, that it wanted her to come outside, to walk across the yard and into the forest. The urge was almost overwhelming, like the strongest thirst she'd ever felt, but magnified 100-fold. She might have done it, might have walked right out of the house and into the waiting arms of whatever was calling to her, but at that moment Tommy's voice came from the hallway behind her, asking if she was all right. The sound of his voice broke the spell, and Beth stumbled backward from the window, gasping as if she'd been holding her breath. When she looked back at the tree line, the white thing was gone. The next morning, Beth told Tommy what she'd seen, and he listened with the same careful attention she'd shown him when he told her about the deer. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee cup, like he might find answers there. Finally, he said they needed to talk to Buck Morrison. Buck had lived in these mountains longer than anyone, and if there was something strange happening in the hollow, he'd know about it. They drove down to Buck's trailer and found him sitting in his usual spot on the front steps, smoking a cigarette and watching the clouds build up over the ridge. Buck listened to their story without interrupting, occasionally nodding or asking a question for clarification. When they finished, he was quiet for so long that Tommy thought he might have fallen asleep. Finally, the old man stubbed out his cigarette and looked at them with eyes that had seen too much. He told them about the Ash Fork Hollow, about the stories his grandfather had told him when he was a boy. According to the old tales, the hollow had been a sacred place for the Cherokee, a spot where the spirits of the dead gathered before making their journey to the Nightland. The Cherokee had left offerings there, food and tobacco and carved bones, to ensure safe passage for their departed loved ones. But something had gone wrong, Buck said. Maybe it was the arrival of white settlers. Maybe it was the logging and mining that had torn up the land. Or maybe it was just the natural progression of things. The spirits that were supposed to guide the dead to their rest had become twisted and hungry, feeding on the offerings and growing stronger with each passing year. The white deer, Buck explained, was a warning. It meant that the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead was breaking down, and something was trying to cross over. The thing Beth had seen at the tree line was just the beginning, a scout testing the strength of the barrier. Buck's grandfather had told him that there was a way to stop it, but it required a sacrifice. Someone from the bloodline that had first disturbed the hollow, the family that had cut the trees and built the first cabin in the area, would have to go back to the stone circle and offer themselves to the spirits. Only then would the boundary be sealed and the dead allowed to rest. Tommy and Beth exchanged glances. Their great-grandfather had been one of the first white settlers in the area, one of the men who'd worked for the logging company. If Buck was right, then their family was responsible for what was happening, and they were the only ones who could stop it. But Buck wasn't finished. He told them that the sacrifice didn't have to be a death. Not exactly. The spirits wanted a life, but they would accept a different kind of payment. Someone could go to the stone circle and offer to take the place of the trapped souls, to become a guide for the dead in exchange for sealing the boundary. It would mean giving up their human life, but they would survive in a different form. Tommy said he would do it, but Beth shook her head. She was the one with the gift, she said. She was the one who could see and hear things that others couldn't. If anyone was going to make this sacrifice, it should be her. They argued about it for the rest of the day, but in the end, Beth won. She was determined to go to the hollow that night, during the full moon, when the boundary would be at its thinnest. Tommy said he would go with her, but she refused. This was something she had to do alone. That evening, as the sun set behind the ridge and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Beth packed a small bag with a few personal items: a photograph of her parents, a carved wooden bird that had belonged to her grandmother, and a small silver cross that her mother had given her. She kissed Tommy goodbye and told him she loved him, then walked out into the night. Tommy watched from the window as she disappeared into the tree line, her white dress ghostly in the moonlight. He wanted to follow her, but he knew she was right. This was something she had to do alone. Instead, he sat on the porch and waited, listening to the sounds of the forest and trying not to think about what might be happening in the hollow. Around midnight, the humming started again. It was louder this time, more complex, like a choir of voices singing in harmony. The sound rose and fell, sometimes beautiful, sometimes terrible, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Tommy could feel it in his bones, in his teeth, in the very air around him. The humming continued for what felt like hours, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was complete, as if every living thing in the forest had stopped breathing at the same moment. Tommy sat on the porch, straining his ears for any sound, but there was nothing. As the sun began to rise, Tommy walked to the edge of the tree line, calling Beth's name. There was no answer, no sign that she had ever been there. He followed the trail into the forest, retracing the path they had taken to the stone circle. But when he reached the clearing, it was empty. The bones were gone, the stones had been scattered, and the twisted skull was nowhere to be seen. In the center of where the circle had been, there was a patch of new grass, green and healthy, as if something had been planted there and was already beginning to grow. Tommy never saw his sister again, but he didn't think she was dead. Sometimes, on nights when the moon was full and the mist was rising from the hollow, he would hear her voice mixed in with the wind. She was singing, he thought, or maybe humming, a wordless melody that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The white thing never came back to the house, and the power company eventually finished their work in the hollow without any further incidents. But Tommy knew that Beth was still there, somewhere in the deep woods, guiding the spirits of the dead to their rest and keeping the boundary between worlds sealed. Maybe you've seen something like this and just didn't realize it. That moment when the world feels thin and you catch a glimpse of something that shouldn't be there. Years passed and Tommy eventually moved away from the mountains. But he never forgot what had happened in the Ash Fork Hollow. He married a woman from Georgia and had 2 children. But he never told them about their Aunt Beth or what she had sacrificed for them. Some stories, he figured, were better left untold. But on quiet nights when the wind is blowing through the trees and the moon is full, he still listens for that humming, that wordless song that drifts up from the hollow like mist. And sometimes, just sometimes, he thinks he can hear her voice, calling to him from the deep woods, reminding him that some debts can never be fully paid, only transferred from one generation to the next. The old man who told me this story passed away last winter, but before he died, he gave me a map he'd drawn of the hollow, with the location of the stone circle marked in red ink. I've never been there myself, but I've heard others talk about it, hunters and hikers who've wandered off the main trails and found themselves in places where the trees grow too thick and the shadows move when they shouldn't. They say the hollow is still there, still waiting, and that on certain nights, you can still hear the humming. That wordless song that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They say if you listen carefully, you can hear a woman's voice mixed in with the wind, calling to the lost souls and guiding them home, but I wouldn't recommend going to look for it. Some places are better left undisturbed, and some stories are meant to stay buried in the deep woods where they belong. The mountains remember everything, and some memories are too dangerous to disturb.